the silence between heartbeats. Samuel Yazzie checked his watch again. 4:47 a.m. The reservation stretched out before him in the pre-dawn darkness, familiar territory he'd hunted since childhood. Yet something felt different this morning. Wrong. The October air carried an unusual stillness that made the hair on his arms stand up beneath his flannel shirt. Even the coyotes had gone quiet, and in 32 years of hunting these lands, Samuel had never heard such complete silence. He shouldered his rifle and stepped out of his weathered Ford pickup, boots crunching on the frost-covered ground. The truck door's slam echoed too loudly in the stillness, making him wince. Samuel had driven out here to the remote section of the Navajo Nation near Canyon de Chelly before sunrise, hoping to catch elk moving to water before the morning heat drove them to shade. His grandfather had taught him this spot decades ago, a natural funnel where game trails converged near a seasonal spring. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness as Samuel made his way along the worn path, his breath visible in small puffs. Something crunched under his boot. He stopped, crouched down, and examined the ground. Pine cones scattered and crushed, but not by any animal he recognized. The pieces were ground almost to powder, as if something massive had stepped on them with incredible force. Samuel stood slowly, scanning the tree line with his flashlight. The beam revealed nothing but juniper and pine, their shadows dancing as the light moved. But the feeling of being watched pressed against his shoulders like a physical weight. He'd felt this before, during his tours in Afghanistan, that sixth sense that kept soldiers alive. Something was out there. He continued along the trail, every sense heightened. The normal sounds of the desert were absent. No owls hooted from the trees. No mice rustled through the brush. Even the constant background hum of insects had vanished, leaving only the sound of his own breathing and footsteps. The silence felt unnatural, oppressive, like the moment before lightning strikes. 20 minutes into his hike, Samuel heard it, a low rumble that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. He froze, finger moving instinctively to his rifle's safety. The sound wasn't quite mechanical, not quite animal. It reminded him of distant thunder, but the sky was clear and stars still visible through the dispersing clouds. The rumble came again, closer this time, from somewhere ahead and to his left. Samuel clicked off his flashlight and waited, letting his eyes adjust to the darkness. The moon provided enough ambient light to make out shapes and movement, and he'd learned long ago that sometimes you could see more without artificial light. Movement caught his eye, a shadow separating from the tree line about 50 yards ahead. It was too tall to be a bear, too broad to be an elk, and moved with a fluid gait that no human possessed. The shadow paused, and Samuel could swear it was looking directly at him despite the distance and darkness. His heart hammered against his ribs as the shadow melted back into the trees. Samuel stood motionless for several minutes, straining to see or hear anything else, but the forest had returned to its unnatural quiet. He clicked his flashlight back on and examined the area where he'd seen the movement. No tracks were visible in the hard-packed earth, but a strong smell hung in the air, musky and wild, like wet dog mixed with something he couldn't identify, something that made his stomach clench with instinctive revulsion. Samuel had grown up hearing the old stories from his grandfather about the creatures that lived in the deep places, the beings that walked like men, but were not men. He'd always dismissed them as traditional tales meant to keep children from wandering too far into the wilderness. But standing here in the darkness with that smell in his nostrils and the memory of that impossible shadow burned into his mind, the stories didn't seem so far-fetched. He continued toward the spring, but every step required conscious effort. His body wanted to turn around, to get back to the truck and drive away from this place, but Samuel had responsibilities. A wife and 2 young children who depended on the meat he brought home, and pride that wouldn't let him run from shadows and strange smells. The trail curved around a large boulder, and Samuel slowed his pace. The spring lay just ahead, a small pool fed by underground seepage that provided water year-round. In the growing light of dawn, he could make out the depression where animals came to drink. What he saw there made his blood freeze. Tracks, massive footprints in the soft mud around the spring's edge. Each print was easily 18 inches long and nearly 8 inches wide, with clearly defined toe impressions. The stride length between prints was longer than any human could manage, and the depth suggested something incredibly heavy had made them. Samuel knelt beside the clearest print, his hands shaking as he held the flashlight steady. The track was fresh, water was still seeping into the deepest impressions. Whatever had made these prints had been here recently, possibly within the last hour. He pulled out his phone to take pictures, but the screen remained black despite pressing the power button repeatedly. The battery had been at 70% when he'd left home 2 hours ago. Samuel shook the phone, tried the power button again, but nothing. The device was completely dead. A branch snapped somewhere behind him. Samuel spun around, rifle raised, safety off. The sound had come from the direction he'd traveled, between him and his truck. Something was moving through the brush with deliberate steps, not trying to hide its approach. The footfalls were heavy, purposeful, and getting closer. He swept the flashlight beam across the tree line, searching for movement. The light caught something pale, moving between the trunks. Too quick to identify. Too large to be any animal he knew. Samuel's mouth went dry. Whatever was out there was circling him, staying just beyond the reach of his light. The smart thing would be to fire a warning shot, make noise, try to scare off whatever predator was stalking him, but something held him back. The deliberate nature of the movements, the intelligence implied in the circling behavior, suggested this wasn't a simple animal that would be frightened by gunfire. Samuel backed toward the spring, keeping his rifle ready and the flashlight moving. He needed to see what he was dealing with before he made any decisions. The beam swept left, right, paused on a cluster of junipers where he thought he'd seen movement, but revealed nothing. Then the smell hit him again, so strong it made his eyes water. The musky, organic stench of something that lived wild and dirty, mixed with the metallic tang of old blood. It was close, very close, and getting stronger. A rock the size of a baseball whistled past his head, missing by inches. Samuel ducked instinctively and spun toward where the projectile had come from. The flashlight beam revealed a massive figure standing in the open, not hiding anymore, about 30 feet away. Samuel's mind struggled to process what he was seeing. The creature stood at least 9 feet tall, covered in dark, matted hair that hung in thick strands from its massive frame. Its shoulders were impossibly broad, its arms hung past its knees, and its head was shaped wrong, too large, too angular, with a pronounced brow ridge that cast deep shadows over its eyes. Those eyes reflected the flashlight beam like an animal's, glowing with an intelligence that was definitely not human, but far too complex to be merely bestial. The creature's face was a nightmare fusion of ape and something else, something that had never been meant to exist in the natural world. Samuel raised his rifle, but his hands were shaking so badly he couldn't get a clear sight picture. The creature made no aggressive moves, just stood there watching him with those terrible, intelligent eyes. It tilted its head slightly, studying him the way a scientist might examine an interesting specimen. "Jesus Christ," Samuel whispered, the words barely audible even to himself. The creature's reaction to his voice was immediate and terrifying. It threw back its head and released a sound that Samuel felt in his bones, a roar that combined the power of a grizzly bear with something uniquely alien. The sound echoed off the canyon walls, seeming to come from everywhere at once. Samuel stumbled backward, his boot catching on a root. He went down hard, the rifle flying from his hands and clattering against the rocks. The flashlight spun away, its beam carving wild arcs through the darkness before coming to rest pointed uselessly at the sky. In the sudden, near darkness, Samuel heard heavy footsteps approaching. He scrambled for his rifle, fingers desperately searching the rocky ground. The footsteps stopped directly in front of him. Samuel looked up and saw the creature looming over him, so close he could feel the heat radiating from its massive body. The smell was overwhelming now, making him gag. In the dim starlight, he could make out more details that his mind desperately wished it couldn't process. The creature's hands were enormous, with fingers that ended in thick, yellowed nails that looked capable of tearing through flesh and bone. Its chest rose and fell with deep, measured breaths, and Samuel could hear a low rumbling sound coming from its throat. Not quite a growl, not quite breathing, something in between that spoke of barely controlled power. Samuel's hand finally found his rifle. He grabbed it, rolled to his side and brought it up. But before he could aim, the creature moved with shocking speed for something so large. A massive hand, if it could be called a hand, slammed into Samuel's chest with the force of a freight train. The impact lifted him off the ground and sent him tumbling down the slope toward the spring. He hit the rocky ground hard, bounced once, and rolled to a stop at the water's edge. Darkness closed over his vision like a curtain being drawn. When consciousness returned, Samuel found himself lying face down in the mud beside the spring, cold water lapping at his face. Every breath sent stabbing pains through his ribs, and his left shoulder felt like it was on fire. He tried to push himself up, but his arms wouldn't cooperate properly. The forest was completely silent again. Samuel managed to roll onto his back, gasping at the pain the movement caused. The sky above was beginning to lighten with the approach of true dawn, and he could make out individual clouds drifting across the stars. He lay there for several minutes, trying to assess his injuries and understand what had happened. His rifle was gone. His flashlight was nowhere to be seen, and the creature, whatever it had been, was no longer visible anywhere in the growing light. Samuel felt like he'd been hit by a truck, but nothing seemed broken. Bruised ribs, maybe, and his shoulder was definitely damaged, but he could move all his extremities. The silence pressed against his eardrums like a physical thing. No birds sang to greet the dawn, no insects buzzed in the grass. Even the water lapping at the spring's edge seemed muted, as if the very air was holding its breath. Samuel slowly worked his way to his feet, using a nearby boulder for support. His legs shook with the effort, and black spots danced at the edges of his vision. Whatever had hit him had done so with incredible force. He was lucky to be alive. He looked around for any sign of the creature, but saw nothing except his own tracks and the massive footprints around the spring. In the growing daylight, those prints looked even more impossible than they had in the darkness. No known animal could have made them. The walk back to his truck took twice as long as the hike in. Samuel had to stop frequently to rest, and his injured shoulder made it difficult to maintain his balance on the uneven terrain. Every shadow made him freeze. Every sound of wind through the trees sent adrenaline coursing through his system. But the forest remained empty and silent around him. When he finally reached the truck, Samuel discovered that his problems weren't over. The vehicle's windshield was spider-webbed with cracks, and deep gouges ran along the driver's side door. The gouges were spaced like finger marks, but far too large and deep for human hands to have made them. Samuel stared at the damage for a long moment, his mind struggling to accept what he was seeing. The creature had been here. It had found his truck and... what? Left a message? A warning? He tried the door handle and was surprised when it opened normally. The interior appeared undamaged, and when he turned the key, the engine started without hesitation. Samuel sat behind the wheel, hands shaking as he gripped the steering wheel and stared out at the forest through the cracked windshield. What the hell was he supposed to tell people about this? The drive back to town passed in a blur of shock and confusion. Samuel's shoulder throbbed with every bump in the road, and his ribs ached with each breath.
but the physical pain was nothing compared to the chaos in his mind as he tried to process what he'd experienced. By the time he reached his house on the outskirts of Chinle, the sun was fully up, and the normal sounds of morning had returned. Birds sang in the cottonwood trees, dogs barked in distant yards, children's voices carried on the morning air as they walked to school. The normalcy of it all made the events at the spring seem like a vivid nightmare. Samuel's wife, Maria, was in the kitchen making breakfast when he walked through the door. She took one look at his muddy clothes and battered appearance and rushed to his side. "Sam, what happened? Are you hurt?" "I'm okay," he said automatically, though they both knew it wasn't true. "Just took a fall." Maria helped him to a chair and began examining his injuries with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd patched up her share of hunting accidents over the years. Her gentle probing of his shoulder made him wince. "This is more than just a fall," she said. "Your shoulder might be dislocated, and these bruises on your chest." She looked at him with concern. "Sam, what really happened out there?" Samuel stared at the kitchen table, trying to find words that wouldn't make him sound insane. How could he explain that he'd been attacked by something that shouldn't exist, that he'd seen a creature straight out of the old stories as real and solid as the chair he was sitting in? "I don't know," he said finally. "Something spooked me. I lost my footing, fell down a slope, hit some rocks. It wasn't entirely a lie. He had fallen, and he had hit rocks. He just left out the part about being thrown by a 9-foot-tall humanoid creature covered in dark hair." Maria didn't look convinced, but she didn't press the issue. Instead, she helped him out of his torn shirt and began cleaning the cuts and scrapes on his arms and back. The warm water stung, but the familiar ritual of wound care helped ground him in the present moment. "Where's your rifle?" Maria asked. Samuel's stomach clenched. He'd forgotten about the rifle in his shock over everything else. It was still out there somewhere, probably lying in the dirt near the spring. "Must have dropped it when I fell," he said. "I'll go back for it later." But even as he said the words, Samuel knew he wasn't going back to that place. Not today, not tomorrow, maybe not ever. Maria bandaged his worst cuts and fashioned a sling for his shoulder. She wanted to drive him to the clinic in town, but Samuel refused. How could he explain his injuries to a doctor without revealing what had caused them? The rest of the morning passed quietly. Maria left for her job at the tribal offices, and their 2 children, 8-year-old Tommy and 6-year-old Sarah, went off to school. Samuel found himself alone with his thoughts and the increasingly surreal memory of what had happened at the spring. He tried calling his brother Joe, thinking he might confide in him about the experience. Joe was a tribal police officer and had heard plenty of strange stories over the years. But when Samuel picked up the phone, he found himself unable to dial the number. What if Joe thought he was losing his mind? What if word got around that Samuel Yazzie was seeing monsters in the forest? Instead, he spent the day restlessly moving around the house, unable to concentrate on anything for more than a few minutes. Every sound from outside made him freeze and listen. The mailman's truck, the neighbor's dog, even children playing in the street. Everything seemed potential threat in his heightened state of awareness. The bruises on his chest were already darkening to deep purple, and when he looked at them in the bathroom mirror, Samuel could clearly make out the outline of massive fingers. The creature's hand had wrapped almost completely around his torso when it struck him. That evening, after Maria and the children had gone to bed, Samuel sat on his front porch with a cup of coffee and stared out at the darkness beyond the streetlights. The normal sounds of night on the reservation, distant music, barking dogs, the occasional car, provided a comforting contrast to the unnatural silence he'd experienced that morning. But as the hours passed and the neighborhood grew quiet, Samuel found his attention focusing on the desert beyond the town's edge. Somewhere out there, In the vast wilderness of canyons and mesas, something impossible was moving through the darkness. Something that had looked at him with intelligence and found him wanting. Sleep came fitfully that night, filled with dreams of glowing eyes and massive footprints. Samuel woke repeatedly, always with the feeling that something was watching the house from the shadows beyond the yard. The next morning brought no relief from his mental turmoil. Samuel called in sick to his job at the power plant, something he'd done perhaps 3 times in the past decade. He couldn't imagine sitting in meetings or operating machinery while his mind was consumed with questions that had no rational answers. Instead, he drove to the tribal library and spent hours researching cryptid sightings in the region. The internet revealed dozens of Bigfoot reports from across the Southwest, some dating back decades. Most were dismissed as hoaxes or misidentifications, but reading them gave Samuel a sick feeling of recognition. The descriptions were consistent: massive bipedal creatures covered in dark hair, incredible strength and speed, intelligence that seemed almost human but fundamentally alien. And always, the witnesses were left with the sense that they'd encountered something that wasn't supposed to exist in the modern world. Samuel found himself paying particular attention to the psychological effects reported by witnesses. Many described lasting anxiety, sleep problems, and an inability to return to the areas where their encounters had occurred. Some had moved away entirely, unable to cope with living near the sites of their experiences. By the time the library closed, Samuel had read dozens of accounts and watched countless video testimonies. None of them provided answers, but they did give him a strange sense of solidarity. He wasn't the first person to experience something impossible, and he wouldn't be the last. The drive home took him past the radio station where his old friend Billy Begay worked as a DJ. Billy's evening show featured local news and community announcements, and he occasionally interviewed tribal members about unusual experiences or local legends. On impulse, Samuel pulled into the parking lot. Billy was surprised to see him, but welcomed Samuel into the small studio during a music break. He was even more surprised when Samuel asked if he could share a story on the air. "What kind of story?" Billy asked, adjusting his headphones. "Something that happened to me yesterday morning, out by Canyon de Chelly." Billy's expression grew more serious. "What kind of something?" Samuel hesitated, then plunged ahead. "An encounter with something that probably shouldn't exist." The next song ended, and Billy had to go back on the air for station identification and weather. But during the following musical segment, he pulled Samuel aside. "You're talking about a creature sighting," Billy said. It wasn't a question. Samuel nodded. "You want to tell that story on the radio? Tonight?" "I think so, yes." Billy studied his friend's face for a long moment. "You look like hell, Sam, and you seem shaken. This really happened. It really happened." 20 minutes later, Samuel found himself sitting across from Billy in the radio station's main studio, a microphone positioned between them. His mouth was dry, and his hands shook slightly as he waited for the current song to end. "This is KTNN, serving the Navajo Nation," Billy said into his microphone. "I'm Billy Begay, and I have with me tonight a longtime friend and member of our community who wants to share an experience he had yesterday morning. Sam, thanks for coming in." "Thanks for having me," Samuel said, his voice sounding strange in the headphones. "Now, you told me this involves an encounter with something unusual. Can you tell our listeners what happened?" Samuel took a deep breath and began to speak. He told the story as simply and honestly as he could, starting with the unnatural silence in the forest and ending with waking up in the mud beside the spring. He described the massive footprints, the creature's appearance, and the overwhelming sense of intelligence in its eyes. He did not mention his damaged truck or his physical injuries. Some details seemed too personal, too frightening to share with an audience of strangers. When he finished, Billy was quiet for a moment. "Sam, this happened yesterday morning, less than 36 hours ago." "Yes. And you're certain about what you saw?" Samuel thought about the question seriously before answering. "I know how it sounds. I know what people will think. But yes, I'm certain. I saw something that isn't supposed to exist, and it saw me back." "Have you reported this to tribal police or park service?" "No. Who would believe it?" Billy nodded, understanding. "Sam, I've known you for 20 years. You're not someone who makes up stories or sees things that aren't there. If you say this happened, I believe it happened." They talked for a few more minutes about the local legends and other reported sightings in the area. Billy mentioned that the station had received calls over the years from listeners describing similar encounters, though most people were reluctant to go into detail on the air. When the interview ended, Samuel felt drained but oddly relieved. He'd told his story to the world, or at least to anyone in the Four Corners region who happened to be listening to KTNN that night. The drive home was peaceful. The act of speaking openly about his experience had lifted some of the psychological weight he'd been carrying. Whatever people might think about his sanity, at least the truth was out there now. But as Samuel pulled into his driveway and saw the familiar lights of his house, he realized that telling his story had changed nothing fundamental about his situation. Somewhere in the darkness beyond the town's edge, something impossible was still moving through the wilderness, something that had looked at him with intelligence and recognition. And deep in his gut, Samuel knew that his encounter at the spring had been more than a chance meeting. The creature had been watching him, studying him, making some kind of decision about him that he couldn't begin to understand. Over the following days, Samuel tried to return to his normal routine. He went back to work, helped his children with their homework, attended a tribal council meeting with Maria, but everything felt different now, as if he was viewing his life through a lens that revealed how fragile and temporary all human activities really were. The physical injuries healed quickly enough. His shoulder stopped aching, and the bruises on his chest faded to yellow and then disappeared entirely. But the psychological effects lingered like a chronic illness that flared up without warning. Samuel found himself avoiding wooded areas entirely. When his job required him to inspect power lines in remote locations, he volunteered for assignments in open desert country instead of the forested regions he'd once preferred. The thought of walking alone among trees filled him with anxiety that bordered on panic. Sleep remained elusive. Samuel would lie awake for hours, listening to every sound from outside the house. When he did manage to fall asleep, his dreams were filled with images of massive footprints, glowing eyes, and shadows moving through darkness with impossible stealth. Maria grew increasingly concerned about his behavior, though she didn't directly confront him about it. She began taking over household tasks that required trips to isolated areas, checking on their small garden plot outside town, visiting elderly relatives who lived in remote locations, even grocery shopping in Gallup when their usual store in Chinley was out of something they needed. The children noticed the change too. Tommy asked why his father no longer took him on hiking trips to collect firewood or explore the canyon country. Sarah wanted to know why Daddy seemed sad all the time. Samuel tried to explain that he was just tired, working too much, dealing with adult stress they wouldn't understand. But he could see the confusion and concern in their young faces, and it added another layer of guilt to his already complicated emotional state. 3 weeks after the encounter, Samuel received a phone call at work that changed everything. "Sam, this is Billy Begay." "Hey, Billy. What's up?" "I've been getting calls about your interview. People who heard your story and want to talk." Samuel's stomach clenched. "What kind of people?" "Mostly locals." Some who've had their own experiences, some who know family members or friends who've seen things. A few researchers from outside the area. Researchers? People who study this kind of thing. Cryptozoologists, anthropologists, that sort. They're respectful, professional. They'd like to interview you, maybe visit the site where it happened. The thought of returning to the spring made Samuel's hands shake. I don't think I'm ready for that. I understand. But Sam, there's something else. One of the callers was Jake Tsosi. Samuel knew the name. Jake was a park ranger at Canyon de Chelly National Monument, a respected member of the community with 30 years of experience in the backcountry. Jake says he's found tracks, Billy continued. Multiple sites, all within a few miles of where your encounter happened. He wants to compare them with what you saw. That afternoon, Samuel met Jake Tsosi at a coffee shop in Chinley. The ranger was a compact man in his 50s with weathered hands and the kind of steady gaze that came from spending most of his life outdoors. I've been working these canyons for 3 decades, Jake said without preamble. I've seen everything that's supposed to live out there and some things that probably aren't. What you described on the radio, it matches things I've been finding but couldn't explain. Jake pulled out a digital camera and showed Samuel a series of photographs, footprints in muddy ground, eerily similar to what Samuel remembered from the spring, deep gouges in tree bark at a height no bear could reach, broken branches and trampled vegetation that suggested something large had passed through recently. These are from 5 different locations, Jake explained, all within a 20-mile radius of where you had your encounter. I've been documenting them for the past 2 years, but I've never seen the creature that made them. Samuel studied the photographs with growing unease. The footprints were virtually identical to what he'd seen, down to the distinctive toe impressions and the impossible stride length. Have you reported this to anyone? Samuel asked. Jake shook his head. Who would I report it to? My supervisors would think I was losing my mind. The FBI? They'd laugh me out of the building. But the evidence is there, Sam. Something is living in those canyons, something we don't have a name for. They talked for an hour, comparing details and sharing observations. Jake had never seen the creature itself, but he'd heard vocalizations that didn't match any known animal. He'd found evidence of crude shelters in remote cave systems. Most disturbing, he'd discovered what appeared to be food caches, piles of bones from deer, elk, and smaller animals, all showing signs of having been deliberately collected and stored. The thing is, Jake said as they prepared to leave, the evidence suggests intelligence. Not just animal cunning, but actual problem-solving ability. Tool use, even if it's primitive, and the creature or creatures seem to be deliberately avoiding human contact while maintaining territories that overlap with recreational areas. Creatures? You think there's more than one? I found prints from at least 3 different individuals, different sizes, different gaits. Could be a family group. The thought made Samuel's blood run cold. He'd been focused on his encounter with a single creature, terrifying as that had been. The possibility of multiple beings living in the canyon country was almost too frightening to contemplate. As Samuel drove home that evening, he found himself looking at the landscape with new eyes. The vast wilderness of northern Arizona suddenly seemed less empty, less known than he'd always assumed. How many other impossible things might be living in the remote places where humans rarely ventured? That night, for the first time since his encounter, Samuel told Maria the complete truth about what had happened at the spring. He described the creature in detail, explained his physical injuries, and admitted that he'd been struggling with anxiety and sleep problems ever since. Maria listened without interruption, her expression growing more concerned as the story unfolded. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" she asked finally. "I was afraid you'd think I was crazy." Sam, I've been married to you for 12 years. I know when you're telling the truth and when you're not. If you say you saw this thing, then you saw it. Her simple acceptance broke down a wall Samuel hadn't realized he'd built around himself. For the first time since the encounter, he felt the crushing weight of isolation begin to lift. "What do we do now?" he asked. "Now we figure out how to help you deal with this, together." They talked until dawn, making plans and setting boundaries. Samuel would continue meeting with Jake Tsosi to share information, but he wouldn't return to the encounter site unless absolutely necessary. They would be more careful about where the children played, keeping them closer to populated areas. And if Samuel's anxiety continued to interfere with his daily life, they would seek professional help. Most importantly, they would face this challenge as a family rather than allowing it to isolate Samuel from the people who mattered most to him. Over the following weeks, Samuel began to feel more like himself again. Talking openly about his experience with Maria and Jake had robbed the memory of some of its power to terrorize him. He still avoided wooded areas and had trouble sleeping, but the constant hypervigilance that had dominated his thoughts began to fade. Jake continued finding evidence of the creature's presence in the canyons, but the frequency of new discoveries decreased as winter approached. The ranger theorized that they might migrate to lower elevations during cold weather, or simply become less active when food was scarce. Samuel never returned to the spring where his encounter had occurred. Jake offered several times to accompany him back to the site, but Samuel politely declined. Some experiences, he decided, were complete in themselves and didn't require revisiting. Instead, he focused on rebuilding his relationship with the landscape he'd always loved. Short hiking trips close to town, always with Maria or the children, helped him remember that not every shadow contained a threat. The desert was still beautiful, still home, even if it now held mysteries he'd never suspected. On a cold December evening, almost 3 months after his encounter, Samuel was working in his garage when he heard a familiar sound from the radio. Billy Begay's voice filled the space as the evening show began. "Good evening, folks. This is KTNN, and I'm Billy Begay. Before we get to tonight's music, I want to share something with you. About 3 months ago, I interviewed a friend of mine about an unusual experience he'd had in our local wilderness. Sam Yazzie told a story that many of you found compelling, and some of you have called in with your own similar experiences." Samuel stopped working and turned up the volume. "Well, I want you folks to know that Sam's story has been having some interesting effects. Dr. Rebecca Martinez from Northern Arizona University has been in touch with several local witnesses, and she's organizing a research project to document and study these encounters scientifically." Samuel's eyebrows rose. This was the first he'd heard of any formal research. "Dr. Martinez wants me to emphasize that this is serious academic work, not some kind of sensationalist ghost hunting. She's looking for people who've had genuine experiences and are willing to share them confidentially with qualified researchers." Billy provided contact information for Dr. Martinez and encouraged anyone with relevant experiences to reach out. He then transitioned into his usual mix of music and community announcements. Samuel turned off the radio and stood in the quiet garage, thinking about Billy's announcement. The idea of academic researchers taking these encounters seriously was both validating and slightly alarming. It suggested that he wasn't alone in his experience, but it also meant that whatever was living in the canyons might soon face much more intensive scrutiny. He thought about the creature he'd encountered, the intelligence in its eyes, the deliberate way it had studied him before striking. Did it understand that its world was about to change? Did it know that its secrets were becoming harder to keep? Samuel pulled out his phone and stared at it for a long moment. Then he scrolled through his contacts until he found Jake Tsosi's number. "Jake, it's Sam. Did you hear Billy's show tonight?" "Yeah, I did. What do you think?" I think maybe it's time we stopped keeping this to ourselves. You want to contact this doctor? Martinez? Samuel took a deep breath. Yeah, I think I do. Good. I've been thinking the same thing. These creatures, whatever they are, they're not going to stay hidden forever. Better that people learn about them from scientists than from sensationalist TV shows. They talked for a few minutes about the potential implications of formal research in the area. Both men recognized that academic attention might change the dynamics of the situation entirely, possibly driving the creatures deeper into hiding or forcing them to relocate to even more remote areas. But they also agreed that the status quo was unsustainable. Too many people had seen too much for the truth to remain hidden indefinitely. Better to have serious researchers documenting and studying the phenomena than to let it remain in the realm of folklore and speculation. Samuel made the call to Dr. Martinez the next morning. She was exactly what he'd hoped for: professional, respectful, and genuinely interested in understanding rather than exploiting his experience. They talked for nearly an hour with Dr. Martinez, asking detailed questions about the encounter and Samuel's observations of the creature's behavior. "Mr. Yazzie," she said near the end of the conversation, "I want you to know that what you're describing is consistent with reports we've received from across the region. You're not alone in this experience, and you're not imagining things." "How many other reports have you received?" 17 credible accounts in the past 5 years, all from the Four Corners area. Most witnesses have been reluctant to go public, but they've been willing to share their experiences confidentially with our research team. 17 people. Samuel felt a mixture of relief and unease at the number. Relief that he wasn't alone, unease at the implications of so many encounters in such a relatively small area. "What happens next?" he asked. "With your permission, we'd like to interview you more extensively. We're also hoping to examine the site where your encounter occurred, though we understand if you're not comfortable returning there yourself." Samuel thought about the spring, the massive footprints, the memory of glowing eyes watching him from the darkness. "I can tell you how to find the place," he said finally, "but I won't be going back there." Dr. Martinez understood completely. 2 weeks later, Jake Tsosi led a small research team to the spring where Samuel's encounter had occurred. They found additional evidence that had been missed during the initial aftermath: hair samples caught on tree bark, more footprints preserved in a protected alcove, and what appeared to be a daybed where something large had rested among the rocks. The hair samples were sent to laboratories for DNA analysis. The results, when they came back 6 weeks later, were inconclusive but intriguing. The genetic material showed markers consistent with primate origins, but with sequences that didn't match any known species. Samuel read Dr. Martinez's preliminary report with fascination and growing acceptance. Whatever he'd encountered at the spring was real, measurable, and unlike anything currently recognized by science. It wasn't a hallucination, a hoax, or a case of mistaken identity. It was exactly what he'd thought it was. Something impossible that nonetheless existed. Spring came early to the high desert that year, and with it came a sense of resolution that Samuel hadn't expected. The academic research continued, but his role in it remained peripheral. He'd shared his story, provided his observations, and helped guide others to the evidence. Now the work of understanding belonged to people better equipped for the task. Samuel found that he could think about his encounter now without the crushing anxiety that had dominated the first few months afterward. The creature was still out there somewhere, still moving through the wilderness with its impossible existence, but it no longer felt like a personal threat. Instead, it had become something else, a reminder that the world was larger and stranger than human understanding could encompass. A humbling experience that had stripped away his assumptions about what was possible and left him with a deeper appreciation for mystery. On a warm evening in April, exactly 6 months after his encounter, Samuel stood on his front porch and looked out at the desert landscape beyond the town's lights. Somewhere in that vast darkness, ancient mysteries continued to unfold according to their own logic. He no longer felt the need to understand or explain those mysteries. It was enough to know that they existed, to carry the memory of that moment when he'd looked into inhuman eyes and seen intelligence looking back. The silence between heartbeats could hold wonders beyond imagining. Samuel went inside to his family, closing the door softly behind him. "In the morning, Doctor." Martinez called with news that the research team had documented fresh evidence at 3 new sites. The creatures were still active, still present in the canyons and forests of the region, but that was someone else's story now. Samuel's had already ended, that moment beside the spring when consciousness had returned and he'd found himself alone under the lightning sky, forever changed by an encounter that could never be fully explained or forgotten. The world moved on, carrying its secrets in the spaces between what could be proven and what could be known. And Samuel Yazzie moved with it, a man who had seen impossible things and lived to tell the tale, even if no one would ever believe it completely. But sometimes, late at night, when the desert wind whispered through the trees, he would remember the weight of that massive hand against his chest and the intelligence burning in those alien eyes. And he would know, with absolute certainty, that he had not been alone in the wilderness that morning. Something had been watching, something had been waiting, something had decided to let him live. The reasons why remained as mysterious as the creature itself, lost in the vast silence between heartbeats, where all the world's impossible truths waited to be discovered by those brave enough or unlucky enough to venture into the darkness beyond the campfire's light. Samuel was content to leave such discoveries to others. He had seen enough wonders for one lifetime. The next case. The bent-barrel Ethan Walsh pressed his boot against the tailgate of his Ford pickup and retied his hiking bootlaces for the 3rd time that morning. Something felt off about the mountain today, though he couldn't put his finger on what exactly. The usual pre-dawn chorus of birds seemed muted, almost hesitant, and the familiar weight of his .30-06 rifle slung across his shoulder felt heavier than normal. He'd been hunting these same Colorado Rockies for 15 years, ever since moving to Durango after his discharge from the Army. But today, the forest felt different. The parking area at the Hermosa Creek trailhead sat empty except for his truck. October elk season typically drew more hunters to this section of the San Juan National Forest, but the recent early snowfall had apparently discouraged most weekend warriors. Ethan preferred it this way. As a carpenter who spent most weekdays framing houses in town, these solo hunting trips offered the solitude he craved. The rhythmic sound of his breathing and the crunch of leaves under his boots usually centered him in ways that nothing else could. But not today. He checked his phone one last time before heading up the trail. 2 bars of signal and 83% battery. His GPS unit, clipped to his belt, showed full satellite lock. Everything looked normal, yet something in the air felt charged, like the moments before a thunderstorm when static electricity makes your skin crawl. He'd learned to trust his instincts during 2 tours in Afghanistan, and those same instincts now whispered warnings he couldn't quite understand. The trail switchbacked up through dense stands of aspen and pine, their golden leaves carpeting the path with a thick layer that muffled his footsteps. Normally, Ethan appreciated the stealth advantage this provided, but today the unusual quiet bothered him. No squirrels chattered warnings from the trees. No ravens called from the peaks above. Even the ever-present whistle of wind through pine needles had faded to an uncomfortable silence. 3 miles up the trail, he paused at a small clearing where he'd glassed elk in previous years. The meadow stretched roughly 50 yards across, bordered by thick timber on all sides. Fresh snow from 2 nights ago still clung to the shadowed areas. but the sunny spots had melted into patches of dark earth and yellowing grass. Ethan pulled out his binoculars and began methodically scanning the tree line. That's when he saw the first track. The impression in a patch of wet soil near the creek measured at least 18 inches long and 8 inches wide, far too large for any known animal in these mountains. Ethan knelt beside it, his breath forming small clouds in the cool morning air. The track showed 5 distinct toe impressions, each ending in what appeared to be a nail or claw mark. The depth suggested something incredibly heavy had made this print. He'd seen bear tracks before, plenty of them, but this was different. The foot appeared almost human in shape, just massively oversized. The stride pattern showed bipedal movement, with tracks spaced roughly 4 feet apart. Whatever made these prints walked upright and possessed a gait far longer than any human could manage. Ethan pulled out his phone to photograph the track, but the screen remained black despite pressing the power button repeatedly. The device had worked perfectly just an hour earlier at the trailhead. He tried his backup camera, a small digital unit he kept for documenting his hunting trips, but it too refused to power on, despite showing a full battery charge the previous evening. A branch snapped somewhere in the timber behind him. He spun around, rifle already moving off his shoulder. The forest appeared normal, just endless ranks of pine and aspen stretching up the mountainside. But his carpenter's trained eye noticed something odd about one of the larger aspens, roughly 30 yards away. The trunk showed fresh scarring, parallel gouges that scored the bark in sets of 5. The marks started about 8 feet off the ground and extended upward another 2 feet. No bear could reach that high, even standing on its hind legs. Ethan approached the damaged tree slowly, rifle now held in a ready position across his chest. The gouges appeared fresh, with white wood showing beneath the stripped bark. Sap still oozed from the deepest cuts. Whatever had made these marks possessed claws or fingernails capable of penetrating 3 inches into living wood. The smell hit him as he got closer to the tree. It was unlike anything he'd encountered in 15 years of hunting these mountains. Imagine wet dog fur mixed with the stench of a garbage dumpster left in the sun, then add notes of something wild and musky that triggered every prey animal instinct in his brain. The odor clung to the inside of his nostrils and seemed to coat his throat when he breathed. He backed away from the tree, suddenly aware of how exposed he stood in the clearing. The surrounding timber now looked less like hunting cover and more like concealment for whatever had made those tracks and claw marks. Ethan had originally planned to hunt the ridgeline another 2 miles up the trail, but something told him to get back to his truck immediately. The rational part of his mind insisted that bears sometimes walked upright, that perspective could make tracks appear larger than reality, that his imagination was filling in details that weren't really there. But his gut reaction, honed by years of staying alive in hostile territory, screamed danger. He turned toward the trail and froze. The path he'd hiked up now showed fresh tracks pressed into the snow patches, the same oversized footprints, but these led downhill toward the trailhead, toward his truck. Whatever had made the prints at the creek had apparently been following him. Ethan's hands began to tremble as he chambered around into his rifle. The familiar weight and feel of the weapon provided some comfort, but not enough to stop the ice-cold sensation spreading through his chest. In Afghanistan, at least he'd known what he was fighting. Here in the Colorado wilderness, something was tracking him that shouldn't exist. The walk back down the trail felt like the longest 3 miles of his life. Every shadow between the trees could hide a threat. Every rustle of wind through leaves might mask the sound of something large moving through the forest. Ethan found himself constantly looking over his shoulder, rifle ready, but saw nothing except wilderness. Halfway down, he noticed more trees showing fresh damage. Aspens and pines alike bore claw marks, some reaching 12 feet up their trunks. Several smaller trees had been snapped off completely, their tops hanging at odd angles or lying across the trail. The breaks appeared recent, with green wood showing at the fracture points. His GPS unit chose that moment to fail completely. The screen flickered twice, then went black. No amount of button pushing could revive it. Ethan felt a spike of panic before remembering that he knew this trail well enough to navigate by landmark. Still, the timing of the equipment failure bothered him. First his phone, then his camera, now his GPS. Either he was experiencing incredibly bad luck, or something was interfering with his electronics. The smell grew stronger as he descended, following him like an invisible presence. Sometimes it seemed to come from his left, sometimes from behind, occasionally from directly ahead. When the wind shifted, he could taste it on his tongue, that wild musk flavor that made his stomach clench with primitive fear. A mile from the trailhead, Ethan heard the sound that would haunt his dreams for years afterward. It started as a low rumble, almost subsonic, felt as much as heard. The vibration seemed to emanate from the forest itself, making his teeth ache and his vision blur slightly. Then it built into something between a roar and a scream, a vocalization no known animal could produce. The sound carried notes of rage and warning, primal communication that needed no translation. Ethan dropped to one knee behind a fallen log, rifle raised toward the timber where the sound had originated. His heart hammered against his ribs so hard he worried it might be audible to whatever was out there. Sweat dripped into his eyes despite the cool October air. The forest fell completely silent after the vocalization ended. Not even the whisper of wind disturbed the sudden stillness. Ethan waited, muscles cramping from maintaining his shooting position, but nothing moved in the trees ahead. After 10 minutes that felt like hours, he resumed his careful descent toward the parking area. Every step seemed to echo too loudly in the unnatural quiet. His breathing sounded like a steam engine in the stillness. The rifle barrel felt slippery in his sweating palms. The trailhead appeared ahead through the trees, his red Ford pickup sitting exactly where he'd left it 4 hours earlier. Ethan had never been so happy to see a vehicle in his life. He quickened his pace, no longer caring about noise discipline. He made it within 50 yards of his truck before realizing he wasn't alone in the parking area. Something large and dark stood behind his pickup, partially concealed by the shadows of the surrounding pines. At first, Ethan's mind tried to process it as a bear or perhaps another hunter, but the proportions were all wrong. Whatever stood there reached nearly 8 feet in height and possessed a breadth of shoulders no human could match. It turned toward him. Ethan found himself staring into a face that belonged in nightmares. Imagine a gorilla's features stretched and refined into something almost human, but not quite. Dark brown fur covered most of the head, but the face showed patches of leathery skin around the eyes and mouth. Those eyes reflected the dim light filtering through the trees, yellow-green and unmistakably intelligent, but with an alien intelligence that had nothing human about it. The creature's mouth hung slightly open, revealing teeth that seemed designed for both vegetation and meat. Its massive chest rose and fell, with breathing that sounded like a bellows working. Even from 50 yards away, Ethan could smell that wild musk scent, now so strong it made his eyes water. For perhaps 10 seconds, hunter and creature regarded each other across the parking area. Ethan felt frozen in place, unable to move or even breathe. Some primitive part of his brain recognized a superior predator and demanded absolute stillness. Then the thing moved. It didn't charge or flee, but instead began walking slowly around the parking area in a wide circle, never taking its eyes off Ethan. The movement was fluid and purposeful, like a large cat stalking prey. Each step showed the casual power of something that could cover ground with terrifying speed if it chose to. Ethan's paralysis broke when the creature completed a quarter of its circle and began moving to cut off his retreat up the trail. His hands shook as he raised the rifle and tried to center the crosshairs on the thing's massive chest. The scope's image wavered with his trembling, making it impossible to aim accurately. The creature stopped circling and fixed its gaze directly on him. Those alien eyes seemed to look right through him, evaluating him the way a person might study an interesting insect. The intensity of that stare made Ethan's skin crawl and his vision tunnel. He pulled back the rifle's bolt to chamber a round, the mechanical action loud in the stillness. The creature's head tilted slightly at the sound, showing what might have been curiosity rather than fear. It took 2 steps closer. Ethan knew he had to shoot. Every survival instinct screamed at him to pull the trigger. His finger found the weapon's safety and clicked it off. The creature was now less than 30 yards away, close enough that he couldn't miss even with shaking hands. But before he could fire, the thing moved with shocking speed. One moment it stood motionless 30 yards away. The next, it covered the distance between them in 3 massive strides that seemed to barely touch the ground. Ethan had time for one panicked thought about how something that large could move so quickly. The creature reached him just as he began to squeeze the trigger. One enormous hand, easily twice the size of a human hand, closed around the rifle barrel and yanked the weapon forward. Ethan, still holding the stock, stumbled toward the creature and found himself looking up into that nightmare face from less than 3 feet away. The smell was overwhelming this close, a combination of wet fur, decay, and wild musk that made his stomach heave. The creature's breath, hot and humid against his face, carried scents of rotting meat and vegetation. Those yellow-green eyes studied him with an intelligence that was definitely not animal, but wasn't human either. Ethan tried to pull the rifle back, but it was like trying to wrestle a piece of rebar away from a bulldozer. The creature's grip on the barrel was absolutely immovable. When he attempted to work the bolt action to chamber another round, the creature's grip tightened and the metal began to groan under the pressure. That's when Ethan realized the thing was slowly bending his rifle barrel. The steel tube, designed to withstand the explosive pressure of high-powered cartridges, deformed like soft aluminum in the creature's grasp. The barrel bent first 30 degrees, then 45, then nearly 90 degrees as the creature applied steady pressure. The metal made sharp cracking sounds as the internal structure failed. Ethan stared in shock at his ruined weapon. The rifle had cost him $800 and had never failed him in 15 years of hunting. Now it was twisted into uselessness by something that shouldn't exist. The creature studied the bent rifle for a moment, then tossed it aside like a broken toy. The weapon landed 20 feet away with a metallic clatter that echoed off the surrounding mountains. Then those alien eyes fixed on Ethan again, and he saw something in them that might have been amusement. For another long moment, they stood frozen in that impossible tableau. Ethan, weaponless and trembling, facing something from humanity's deepest nightmares. The creature, casual in its overwhelming superiority, studying him with what seemed like mild curiosity. Then, without warning, it stepped backward and melted into the forest. Ethan blinked, and the thing was gone, vanished into the timber with less sound than a deer might make. If not for the twisted rifle lying on the ground and the lingering musk scent, he might have convinced himself the entire encounter was a hallucination. His legs gave out, and he sat down hard on the gravel parking area. His hands shook so violently he couldn't have lit a cigarette if his life depended on it. Every muscle in his body felt like jelly, drained of strength by the massive adrenaline dump of the past few minutes. It took him nearly 10 minutes to gather enough composure to stand up and retrieve his ruined rifle. The barrel was bent at a perfect 90-degree angle, the metal showing stress fractures where the creature's fingers had gripped it. No human being possessed the strength to bend steel like that. Hell, he doubted most machinery could deform a rifle barrel so cleanly. Ethan fumbled for his truck keys with hands that still trembled uncontrollably. The Ford started immediately, its familiar engine sound providing the first comfort he'd felt in hours. He threw the bent rifle into the back seat and backed out of the parking area without bothering to check his mirrors. The drive down the mountain road passed in a blur of adrenaline and disbelief. Ethan found himself constantly checking his rearview mirror, half expecting to see something large and dark following his truck. The radio played classic rock at low volume, but the familiar songs sounded strange and distorted to his ears. Everything felt surreal, like he was viewing the world through thick glass. In the town of Durango, normal life continued obliviously. People walked dogs, shopped for groceries, and went about their Saturday routines without any idea that something impossible existed just 30 miles away in the mountains. Ethan felt disconnected from all of it, like he'd returned from another planet. He drove straight to the Durango Police Department. Officer Jennifer Martinez had dealt with plenty of strange reports during her 8 years with the DPD, but this one definitely made the top 10. The man sitting across from her desk appeared rational and coherent, if somewhat shaken. His carpenter's clothes were dirty, and he smelled like he'd spent time outdoors, which supported his story about hunting. But the tale he told belonged in a tabloid magazine, not a police report. "So, you're saying this creature bent your rifle barrel with its bare hands?" Officer Martinez struggled to keep skepticism out of her voice. Ethan nodded and gestured toward the weapon lying on her desk. "It's right there. Look at it." Martinez had examined the rifle before beginning the interview. The barrel was indeed bent at a 90-degree angle, the metal showing clear stress marks. But there were plenty of ways a rifle could get damaged. "Mr. Walsh, have you considered that your weapon might have been damaged some other way? Maybe caught in a deadfall or struck by a falling rock?" "No." Ethan's voice carried absolute certainty. "I saw it happen. That thing grabbed my rifle and bent it like it was made of wire." "This thing you described as 8 feet tall, covered in dark fur, walking upright." Martinez consulted her notes. "Are you familiar with bear behavior, Mr. Walsh? Black bears sometimes stand on their hind legs when investigating threats. In poor lighting conditions, perspective can be deceiving." Ethan leaned forward in his chair. "Officer, I've been hunting these mountains for 15 years. I know what a bear looks like. This wasn't a bear." Martinez had heard similar statements from dozens of people reporting everything from UFO sightings to alien abductions. They all shared that same tone of absolute conviction. "Have you been drinking today, Mr. Walsh? Using any medications or recreational substances?" "Nothing. I don't even drink coffee before hunting." Ethan's frustration was evident in his voice. "Look, I know how this sounds. If someone told me this story, I'd probably think they were crazy too. But it happened. I understand this has been traumatic for you." Martinez tried to inject some sympathy into her tone. "Mountain environments can be stressful, especially when you're alone. Sometimes our minds fill in details that aren't really there." Ethan stood up abruptly. "You think I'm hallucinating? I think you experienced something frightening and your brain is trying to make sense of it. That's normal. But sir, there's no such thing as Bigfoot." "Then explain the rifle." Martinez had no good answer for that. The weapon was definitely damaged, but damage alone didn't prove the existence of cryptozoological creatures. "I'll file your report, Mr. Walsh. If we receive any similar accounts, we'll investigate further." Ethan picked up his twisted rifle and headed for the door. "You won't investigate anything? You think I'm some kind of nutcase?" "Sir, we take all reports seriously." "No, you don't." Ethan paused at the door. "But if you ever want to see something that'll change your mind about what's possible, take a drive up the Hermosa Creek Trail. Just don't go alone." After Ethan left, Officer Martinez stared at her notes for several minutes. The man had seemed genuinely shaken by whatever had happened to him in the mountains. His story was consistent, his demeanor sincere, and his physical evidence of the damaged rifle was certainly unusual. But policy required rational explanations for reported incidents. She typed up a brief report categorizing the incident as equipment damage, unknown cause, and filed it in the system. The report would be archived with hundreds of other odd incidents that didn't fit standard categories. Martinez made a mental note to ask the Forest Service if they'd received any unusual wildlife reports from the Hermosa Creek area. Then she moved on to the next case and forgot about Ethan Walsh's bent rifle. The Durango Herald newspaper occupied a small building on Main Avenue, its windows filled with awards for local journalism dating back 30 years. Editor Tom Brennan had seen his share of strange stories during his career, but most never made it past the initial phone call. When Ethan Walsh walked into the newsroom carrying a twisted rifle, however, Brennan's journalistic instincts perked up. "You're saying something bent this rifle barrel with its bare hands?" Brennan examined the weapon under his desk lamp. The metal showed clear deformation, with what appeared to be finger impressions in the steel. Ethan nodded. 8 feet tall, covered in dark brown fur, walked upright like a person, but built like a gorilla. Brennan had worked for newspapers in Denver and Colorado Springs before moving to Durango, and he'd learned to recognize certain types of stories. UFO sightings, ghost encounters, and Bigfoot reports all shared common characteristics. The witnesses were usually sincere, but mistaken, their experiences colored by expectation and popular culture. But this physical evidence was troubling. "Mr. Walsh, I have to ask the obvious question. Is there any chance this rifle was damaged by conventional means, caught in machinery, run over by a vehicle, something like that?" "I've told this story 3 times today," Ethan replied with obvious fatigue. "The police, my brother, now you. Everyone wants to explain away what I saw, instead of actually listening to what happened." Brennan studied the man across from his desk. Walsh appeared to be in his 40s, with calloused hands and the weathered skin of someone who worked outdoors. His clothing was practical rather than fashionable, and his truck in the parking lot showed the wear typical of a working man's vehicle. Nothing about him suggested the type of personality that sought attention through elaborate hoaxes. "Let's say I believe your story," Brennan said carefully. "What would you want me to do with it? Print it. Let people know there's something up there. Mr. Walsh, you understand that publishing a Bigfoot story would destroy whatever credibility this newspaper has built over 30 years. Our readers trust us to report facts, not folklore." Ethan leaned back in his chair. "So, you think I'm lying?" "I think you experienced something traumatic, and your mind is trying to process it. That's not the same as lying." "Look at the rifle again." Ethan's voice carried a note of desperation. "Really look at it. Tell me how steel gets bent like that in nature." Brennan examined the weapon again, noting the finger-like impressions in the barrel. The deformation was certainly unusual, but unusual didn't equal impossible. Heavy machinery could produce similar results, as could certain types of accidents. "I'll tell you what," Brennan said finally. "Let me do some research on this. Check with the Forest Service. See if there have been any other unusual reports from that area. If I find corroborating evidence, maybe we can do a feature story about unexplained incidents in the San Juan National Forest." Ethan stood up and reached for his rifle. "In other words, you're going to bury this?" "I'm going to investigate it professionally. That's what journalists do." "Right." Ethan headed for the door. "When something kills a hiker up there, remember this conversation." After Walsh left, Brennan stared at his notes for several minutes. The story had all the elements of classic cryptozoology folklore, but the physical evidence was genuinely puzzling. He made a note to call the Forest Service on Monday and check for any unusual wildlife reports. Then he deleted his notes and moved on to a story about the upcoming city council election. Newspaper credibility was hard to build and easy to destroy, and Bigfoot stories belonged in supermarket tabloids, not legitimate journalism. Dr. Sarah Chen had been practicing emergency medicine at Mercy Regional Medical Center for 12 years, and she'd learned to recognize the symptoms of psychological trauma. The man sitting on the examination table showed classic signs: rapid pulse, elevated blood pressure, dilated pupils, and a slight tremor in his hands. His story, however, was unlike anything she'd encountered. "Mr. Walsh, you said this encounter occurred approximately 6 hours ago." Ethan nodded. "Around 11 this morning. I came straight here after the police station and the newspaper." Dr. Chen made notes on her tablet. "Have you experienced any loss of consciousness, nausea, or disorientation since then?" "Just the shaking, and I can't seem to get warm." "That's consistent with an acute stress reaction." Dr. Chen chose her words carefully. "The human body produces powerful chemicals during frightening experiences. These can affect perception and memory in significant ways." "You think I imagined it?" "I think you experienced something that triggered a massive fight or flight response. Sometimes our brains fill in details to make sense of traumatic events." Ethan laughed bitterly. "Everyone keeps saying that, but nobody can explain the rifle." Dr. Chen had examined the bent weapon in the waiting room. The deformation was certainly unusual, but she'd seen enough accident victims to know that metal could be twisted in surprising ways under extreme forces. "Mr. Walsh, I'd like to prescribe a mild sedative to help with the anxiety symptoms. I'd also recommend following up with a counselor who specializes in trauma therapy." "I don't need therapy. I need someone to believe what I saw." "Belief isn't really the issue here. What matters is helping you process this experience in a healthy way." Ethan slid off the examination table. "You all sound the same. The cop, the reporter, now you. It's like you're reading from the same script." Dr. Chen had dealt with similar situations before. Trauma victims often felt isolated when their experiences didn't fit conventional explanations. "Mr. Walsh, I'm not dismissing what happened to you. I'm simply trying to help you understand the body's response to extreme stress." "Save it, Doc." "I know what I saw." After Ethan left, Dr. Chen completed her report and flagged it for the hospital's psychiatric consultation service. The patient showed signs of acute stress disorder, but wasn't an immediate danger to himself or others. Still, someone who believed in Bigfoot encounters might benefit from professional counseling. She made a note to call his primary care physician on Monday with a referral recommendation, then moved on to her next patient. The drive home to Ethan's small house on the outskirts of Durango passed in a fog of exhaustion and frustration. Every authority figure he'd contacted had offered the same response: sympathy mixed with subtle suggestions that he'd suffered some kind of breakdown. The bent rifle, his only physical evidence, was dismissed as explainable by conventional means. His house sat on 2 acres of pine and oak trees, backing up to Forest Service land. Normally, Ethan found peace in the wilderness setting, but tonight the dark trees seemed to press closer to his windows. Every shadow could hide something large and watching. He carried the twisted rifle inside and propped it against the living room wall where he could see it from his chair. The bent barrel caught the lamplight, reflecting metal stress fractures that no human strength could have created. Whatever had done this possessed power beyond anything in the natural world. Ethan poured 3 fingers of bourbon and sat down to consider his options. The police thought he was delusional. The newspaper editor thought he was mistaken. The doctor thought he was traumatized. No one would take his story seriously without better evidence. But what kind of evidence would convince them? The tracks he'd seen were probably melted by now. The claw marks on trees could be dismissed as bear damage. His electronics had failed at the worst possible moments, leaving him with no photos or recordings. Only the bent rifle remained, and apparently that wasn't enough. The bourbon burned going down, but did nothing to warm the cold spot in his chest. For the first time in his adult life, Ethan felt completely powerless. He'd faced enemy fire in Afghanistan, survived construction accidents, and weathered the death of both parents. But none of those experiences had left him feeling this helpless. Something that shouldn't exist had destroyed his weapon like it was a toy, then vanished into the forest without leaving a trace. It was still out there, somewhere in the dark mountains, and no one would believe him. He refilled his glass and tried to focus on normal things. Monday, he'd returned to the construction site where his crew was framing a new house on the north side of town. The familiar routine of measuring, cutting, and nailing lumber might help restore some sense of normalcy to his life. But every time he closed his eyes, he saw those alien yellow-green eyes staring at him with inhuman intelligence. Ethan's phone rang at 2:47 a.m., jolting him awake from troubled dreams. The caller ID showed his brother's number. "Mike? What's wrong?" "Jesus, Ethan, you scared the hell out of me today. I've been thinking about what you told me." Mike Walsh worked as a paramedic in Farmington, New Mexico, about an hour south of Durango. The brothers had always been close, and Mike was one of the few people who might actually listen to Ethan's story without immediately assuming mental illness. "I know how it sounds. No, listen to me. I've been doing some research online. There's a whole database of similar reports from Colorado and New Mexico. The Four Corners region has more Bigfoot sightings than almost anywhere else in the country." Ethan sat up in bed, suddenly fully awake. "What kind of reports?" "Hunters, hikers, even some Forest Service people. Most of them describe the same thing you did. 8 to 10 feet tall, dark fur, walking upright, incredible strength. And get this, several mention problems with electronic equipment during encounters." "You're serious?" "Dead serious. There's a research group called the Colorado Bigfoot Investigators that documents this stuff. They've got over 200 reports from our area dating back 30 years. Ethan felt a mixture of relief and vindication wash over him. If other people had seen similar things, maybe he wasn't losing his mind after all. "Mike, you don't know how good it feels to hear someone say that." "I'm not saying I believe in Bigfoot," Mike cautioned, "but I believe you saw something that scared the hell out of you. And if other people are seeing the same thing, maybe there's a rational explanation." "Like what?" "I don't know. Escaped zoo animal, maybe. Or some kind of bear with a genetic mutation. The point is, you're not the only one." They talked for another hour, with Mike reading summaries of similar encounters from the database he'd found. The details were remarkably consistent across different witnesses: the size, the smell, the bipedal movement, the intelligence in the eyes, and especially the electronic interference. When Ethan finally hung up, he felt better than he had since returning from the mountain. Maybe the authorities wouldn't believe him, but at least he wasn't alone in his experience. Sunday morning brought clear skies and warm sunshine, but Ethan couldn't bring himself to enjoy the weather. The bent rifle leaning against his living room wall served as a constant reminder of what had happened, and he found himself checking the locks on his doors multiple times throughout the day. His neighbor, Jim Rodriguez, stopped by around noon to borrow a socket wrench and noticed the twisted weapon. "Holy shit, Ethan. What happened to your rifle?" Ethan had prepared for this question. "Accident up on the mountain yesterday. Got it caught in a deadfall." Jim examined the bent barrel more closely. "Damn, that must have been some serious pressure. This steel is completely deformed." "Yeah, it happened fast." "You hurt?" "Just my pride. That rifle cost me $800. Jim whistled low. "Insurance cover something like that?" "Doubt it. I'll probably have to eat the loss." After Jim left, Ethan realized how easily the lie had come. He was already learning to conceal what had really happened, editing his story to fit what people could accept. The truth was too disturbing for normal conversation. That evening, he called the Colorado Bigfoot investigators number his brother had found. A woman named Patricia Kellerman answered on the second ring. CBI Research, this is Pat. Hi, my name is Ethan Walsh. I had an encounter yesterday and my brother found your website. What kind of encounter, Mr. Walsh? Ethan told his story again, this time to someone who didn't interrupt with skeptical questions or suggestions about stress-induced hallucinations. Patricia listened without comment until he finished. Mr. Walsh, that's a very compelling account. The details are consistent with other reports we've received from the San Juan National Forest area, particularly the electronic interference and the demonstration of strength. So you believe me? I believe you experienced something extraordinary. Whether it was a Sasquatch is a question we can only answer through careful investigation. Patricia explained that CBI was a volunteer organization of researchers who documented unexplained encounters throughout Colorado. They didn't claim that Bigfoot definitely existed, but they collected reports with scientific methodology in hopes of eventually solving the mystery. Would you be willing to meet with one of our investigators? We'd like to document your experience in detail and possibly visit the encounter site. Ethan felt a surge of hope. Finally, someone was taking his story seriously. Yes, absolutely. I'll have Dr. Robert Yazzie contact you tomorrow. He's our lead field investigator, and he's familiar with the Hermosa Creek area. After hanging up, Ethan felt more optimistic than he had since the encounter. Maybe these researchers would find evidence that the authorities couldn't dismiss. Maybe he'd finally have proof that what happened was real. Dr. Robert Yazzie arrived at Ethan's house Monday evening, driving a dust-covered Jeep Cherokee loaded with research equipment. A professor of anthropology at Fort Lewis College, Yazzie had been investigating cryptozoological reports in the Southwest for 15 years. His academic credentials gave the Colorado Bigfoot investigators a credibility that most such groups lacked. Mr. Walsh, I appreciate you taking the time to meet with me. Yazzie was a tall Navajo man in his 50s, with graying hair and intelligent dark eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. His demeanor was professional, but not dismissive. They sat in Ethan's living room while Yazzie recorded their conversation with a small, digital device. His questions were detailed and precise, covering everything from the weather conditions during the encounter to Ethan's psychological state before and after. You mentioned that your electronic devices failed during the incident. Can you be more specific about the timing? Ethan tried to reconstruct the sequence of events. My phone died first when I tried to photograph the track. Then my camera wouldn't work. The GPS failed on the way back down the trail. And they've worked normally since then. Yeah, everything's fine now. Yazzie made notes on a tablet computer. We've documented similar electronic interference in roughly 30% of our cases. The mechanism is unclear, but the pattern is consistent. Any theories about what causes it? Several. Some researchers suggest that large primates might generate powerful electromagnetic fields through static electricity buildup in their fur. Others think the stress of the encounter might affect the witness's memory of equipment failures. Yazzie examined the bent rifle with obvious interest, taking measurements and photographs from multiple angles. He also collected samples of dirt and vegetation from Ethan's boots and clothing for later analysis. Dr. Yazzie, what do you think happened to me? I think you encountered something extraordinary. Whether it was a Sasquatch, an unknown primate species, or something else entirely, I can't say definitively. But your account matches too many others to dismiss as hallucination or hoax. The police think I'm crazy. Law enforcement officers deal with facts they can prove in court. Cryptozoological evidence rarely meets that standard, unfortunately. Yazzie packed up his equipment and prepared to leave. Mr. Walsh, would you be willing to guide me to the encounter site tomorrow? I'd like to search for physical evidence while the trail is still relatively fresh. Ethan felt his stomach clench at the thought of returning to Hermosa Creek. I don't know if that's a good idea. I understand your reluctance, but if there's physical evidence at the site, it might be the key to proving what happened to you. After a long moment, Ethan nodded. Okay, but we go armed and we don't stay after dark. Agreed. I'll bring backup firearms and radio equipment. Tuesday morning dawned grey and overcast, with low clouds clinging to the mountain peaks. Ethan met Dr. Yazzie at the Hermosa Creek trailhead at 7 a.m., both men carrying rifles and enough equipment for a serious research expedition. How are you feeling about returning here? Yazzie asked as they checked their gear. Nervous as hell, Ethan admitted, but I need to know if there's evidence up there. The hike up the trail felt completely different with company. Yazzie moved quietly for an academic, and his calm professionalism helped ease some of Ethan's anxiety. Still, every shadow in the forest seemed threatening, and Ethan found himself constantly scanning the trees for movement. The encounter site is just ahead, Ethan said, as they approached the clearing where he'd first seen the tracks. Yazzie immediately began methodically searching the area with scientific precision. He photographed the scarred aspen tree and took samples of the gouged bark. He found several footprint impressions near the creek, including one clear track that measured 19 inches long. This is excellent, Yazzie said, making a plaster cast of the best print. The ridge detail and toe impressions are very clear. Ethan watched the researcher work with growing excitement. Finally, someone was treating his experience as legitimate rather than dismissing it out of hand. They spent 3 hours documenting everything they could find: footprints, claw marks, broken vegetation, and several hair samples snagged on low branches. Yazzie's equipment recorded electromagnetic readings, temperature fluctuations, and even ultrasonic frequencies that might indicate large animal presence. Dr. Yazzie, this is more evidence than I expected to find. Sasquatch encounters often leave significant physical traces. The challenge is getting the scientific community to examine the evidence objectively. As they prepared to leave the site, Yazzie's radio crackled with static. He tried to contact his research partner back in Durango, but the device produced only white noise despite showing full battery power. Interesting, Yazzie said. We're experiencing the same electronic interference you reported. Ethan felt vindicated but also nervous. If the equipment was failing, did that mean something was nearby? They made the descent quickly, both men alert for any signs of the creature's presence. The forest remained quiet, but that unnatural silence Ethan remembered from his original encounter had returned. No birds sang, no squirrels chattered, even the wind seemed muted. Back at the trailhead, Yazzie's radio immediately began functioning normally. Mr. Walsh, I want to thank you for your cooperation. This has been one of our most productive investigations. What happens now? I'll analyze all the evidence we collected. The plaster casts will be compared to our database of known prints. The hair samples will be sent to a genetics lab for species identification. The electromagnetic readings might help explain the equipment failures. How long before you have results? 2 to 3 weeks for the hair analysis. The other tests can be completed sooner. Ethan felt a mixture of hope and impatience. After days of being dismissed and doubted, he desperately wanted scientific proof of what he'd experienced. Dr. Yazzie, do you think I'll ever get official recognition of what happened? Mr. Walsh, in my 15 years of research, I've documented dozens of encounters similar to yours. The evidence is compelling, but the scientific establishment remains reluctant to acknowledge the possibility of unknown primate species in North America. So nothing will change. Change happens slowly in science. But every documented case like yours adds to the body of evidence. Eventually, the weight of proof will force official recognition. They shook hands, and Yazzie drove away, leaving Ethan alone in the parking area where his nightmare had begun. He looked up at the mountains rising around him, wondering if something large and dark was watching from the tree line. The following weeks passed slowly for Ethan. He returned to work, framing houses and trying to maintain normal routines, but his concentration suffered. Every unexpected sound made him jump. Every shadow seemed threatening. His co-workers noticed his nervousness, but attributed it to job stress. Dr. Yazzie called 2 weeks later with preliminary results. The hair samples were inconclusive, he reported. The lab found primate DNA, but it was too degraded to identify a specific species. Could be human contamination from the collection process. Ethan felt disappointment settle in his chest. What about the footprint casts? Those are more promising. The dermal ridge patterns are consistent with a large primate, but they don't match any known species in our database. The foot structure suggests bipedal locomotion with adaptations for both terrestrial and arboreal movement. Does that prove anything? It proves that something made those tracks. Whether it was a Sasquatch or an unknown species of bear or primate, I can't say definitively. Ethan had hoped for more conclusive results, but at least the evidence supported his story rather than contradicting it. Dr. Yazzie, what should I do if I encounter this thing again? Try to get photographic evidence if possible, but don't put yourself at risk. If these creatures exist, they're clearly powerful enough to be dangerous. After hanging up, Ethan stared at his bent rifle propped against the living room wall. The scientific evidence was interesting, but not definitive. The authorities still wouldn't take his story seriously. Nothing had really changed, except his own understanding that he wasn't alone in his experience. 3 weeks after the encounter, Ethan's brother Mike called with disturbing news. "There's been another sighting," Mike said without preamble. A family camping near Vallecito Lake reported something large and bipedal watching their campsite. Forest Service rangers found tracks. Vallecito Lake was only 15 miles from the Hermosa Creek area. If the same creature was involved, it was moving through a fairly large territory. "Anyone get photos?" The dad tried, but his camera malfunctioned. Sound familiar? Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. Mike, what if this thing starts getting aggressive? What if it hurts someone? I don't know, brother. But maybe now the authorities will start taking these reports seriously. The Vallecito Lake incident did generate more attention than Ethan's original report. The camping family included a Denver attorney who knew how to deal with bureaucracy, and their statements were more difficult to dismiss. The Forest Service issued a generic warning about unusual wildlife activity in the region and increased ranger patrols. But no official acknowledgement of Sasquatch was forthcoming. Ethan began following cryptozoology websites and forums, reading about similar encounters throughout the Rocky Mountain region. The accounts were remarkably consistent: large bipedal creatures, electronic interference, incredible strength, and official denial. He was part of a scattered community of witnesses whose experiences were systematically ignored by mainstream science and government. A month after his encounter, Ethan received an unexpected phone call. "Mr. Walsh? This is Agent Rebecca Torres with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. I'd like to discuss your report regarding unusual wildlife in the San Juan National Forest." Ethan was surprised that a federal agency was finally showing interest. "I told my story to the local police. They didn't seem very concerned. We've received several similar reports from the Four Corners region. I'd like to meet with you to discuss the details." They arranged to meet at a coffee shop in downtown Durango. Agent Torres turned out to be a serious woman in her 30s, dressed in the khaki uniform of a federal wildlife officer. She listened to Ethan's account without interruption, taking detailed notes. Mr. Walsh, have you discussed this incident with any media outlets or research organizations? Ethan mentioned his conversations with the newspaper and Dr. Yazzi's investigation. Torres seemed particularly interested in the scientific evidence that had been collected. I need to ask you not to discuss this case with anyone else for the time being. We're conducting a broader investigation into reports of unusual primate activity in the region. Are you saying the government believes in Bigfoot? I'm saying we're investigating reports of unidentified large mammals that may pose a threat to public safety. If such animals exist, they would fall under federal wildlife protection laws. Torres left her business card and asked Ethan to call if he had any additional encounters. Her involvement suggested that official interest in these cases was higher than local authorities had indicated, but it also raised disturbing questions about what the government might already know. 6 weeks after the encounter, Ethan found himself avoiding the mountains entirely. The wilderness that had provided peace and solitude for 15 years now felt contaminated by the memory of those alien eyes and impossible strength. He sold his remaining hunting rifles and cancelled his elk hunting plans for the rest of the season. His sleep remained troubled, filled with dreams of dark shapes moving through pine forests. He started leaving lights on at night and double-checking his door locks. Therapists might call it post-traumatic stress, but Ethan knew the real cause of his anxiety. Something that shouldn't exist was still out there. The bent rifle barrel became a conversation piece when friends visited, though Ethan had perfected his cover story about deadfall accidents. Only his brother Mike knew the real truth, and Mike had stopped bringing up the subject after Ethan made it clear he wanted to move on. But moving on proved impossible when the evidence sat in his living room every day. Dr. Yazzie called in early December with final results from the investigation. The electromagnetic readings we recorded are unlike anything in our database, he reported. The frequency patterns suggest a source of powerful bioelectric fields, possibly generated by an unknown physiological process. What does that mean in plain English? It means something at that site was producing electromagnetic interference, consistent with your equipment failures. We can't identify the source, but we can prove the effect existed. The scientific evidence was mounting, but it still fell short of definitive proof. Yazzie's research would be published in a cryptozoology journal, adding to the academic literature on unknown primate sightings. But mainstream science would continue to dismiss the findings as inconclusive. Winter brought snow to the San Juan Mountains, making travel into the backcountry more difficult. The frequency of Sasquatch reports typically decreased during cold months, though researchers debated whether this reflected seasonal migration or simply reduced human activity in the wilderness. Ethan used the respite to try rebuilding his normal life, but success was limited. The encounter had changed him in fundamental ways, stripping away assumptions about the natural world that he'd held since childhood. Reality was more complex and frightening than he'd previously understood. Spring brought a new wave of sightings as people returned to the mountains for hiking and camping. Dr. Yazzie contacted Ethan about several encounters near Durango that showed similar patterns: electronic interference, physical evidence, and official skepticism. Mr. Walsh, we're organizing an expedition to establish long-term monitoring in the Hermosa Creek area. Would you consider participating as a guide? Ethan's first instinct was to refuse. He'd spent months trying to forget what happened at that site, but part of him remained curious about the creature and frustrated by the lack of definitive answers. What kind of monitoring? Motion-activated cameras, electromagnetic sensors, audio recording equipment. We want to document activity in the area over a full season. You think it's still there? Something is. We've had 3 more reports from that general area since your encounter. Ethan agreed to help with the initial setup, though he insisted on carrying firearms and maintaining radio contact with the outside world. The expedition was scheduled for late May, when snow conditions would allow access to the higher elevations. As the date approached, Ethan found himself both dreading and anticipating the return to Hermosa Creek. 12 months after his encounter, he would face the place where his understanding of the possible had been shattered by 10 seconds of impossible reality. The bent rifle barrel still leaned against his living room wall, a twisted reminder that some truths were too strange for civilized acceptance. But truth didn't require belief to remain true. Something existed in the Colorado wilderness that science couldn't explain and authorities wouldn't acknowledge. Ethan Walsh had stared into its alien eyes and felt its impossible strength bend steel like wire. Whether anyone believed him or not, he knew what he'd seen, and it was still out there. The morning before the research expedition, Ethan stood in his backyard looking up at the pine-covered mountains that rose behind his house. Somewhere in those peaks and valleys, something watched and waited with yellow-green eyes that reflected an intelligence older than human civilization. He touched the bent rifle barrel one more time, feeling the metal stress fractures under his fingertips. Tomorrow, he would return to the place where everything had changed, armed with better equipment and scientific support. Maybe this time they would get the proof that the world needed. Or maybe some mysteries were meant to remain unsolved. The sun set behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the forest. In the gathering darkness, Ethan thought he heard something calling from the wilderness, a sound that was almost human but not quite, carrying notes of wildness that made his skin crawl and his heart race. He went inside and locked the door, but the sound echoed in his memory long after the mountains fell silent. Some encounters leave scars that never heal. Some truths are too large for comfortable acceptance, and some creatures exist in the spaces between what we know and what we fear to acknowledge. Ethan Walsh learned all of these lessons on a October morning in the Colorado Rockies, when something that shouldn't exist bent his rifle barrel like soft metal and disappeared into the forest without leaving a trace that anyone would accept as proof. The evidence remained, twisted and undeniable, but evidence, he had discovered, was not the same as belief, and belief was not the same as truth. The next case. The heavy footsteps. Adam Brooks pulled his orange vest tighter against the October chill as he stepped out of his pickup truck. The parking area at the base of Bear Mountain was empty except for tire tracks from other hunters who'd arrived before dawn. He checked his watch. 5:47 a.m., perfect timing. The Pennsylvania Game Commission had extended bear season through the end of the month, and Adam intended to make the most of it. He'd been hunting these woods for 12 years, ever since moving to Bradford County after his discharge from the Army. The familiarity of the terrain gave him confidence that other hunters lacked. He knew where the game trails converged, where bears denned up during the day, and which ridges offered the best vantage points. More importantly, he knew how to read the woods when something felt wrong. This morning, something felt wrong. Adam couldn't pinpoint exactly what it was as he shouldered his rifle and locked the truck. The forest was too quiet, maybe. Or perhaps it was the way the morning mist clung to the valleys below, thicker than usual for this time of year. He'd learned to trust his instincts during 2 tours in Afghanistan, and those same instincts were whispering warnings now. He pushed the feeling aside and started up the familiar trail. The path wound through a stand of hemlock before branching off toward his favorite hunting spot, a natural blind formed by fallen logs about 2 miles up the mountain. From there, he could watch 3 different game trails while remaining completely concealed. He'd taken his best buck from that position 4 years ago. The climb took 45 minutes, and by the time Adam reached his destination, the sun was beginning to filter through the canopy. He settled into position behind the fallen logs and checked his rifle. The Remington 700 was loaded with 180 grain bullets, more than enough to drop a black bear at this range. He pulled out his thermos and poured coffee into the metal cup, inhaling the steam as he scanned the woods ahead. The first hour passed without incident. A few squirrels chattered in the trees above him, and twice he caught sight of white-tailed deer picking their way through the underbrush. Normal morning activity. The woods were waking up, finding their rhythm. Adam began to relax. That's when he heard the first sound. It came from somewhere uphill, maybe 300 yards away. A sharp crack, like a branch breaking under weight. Adam froze with the coffee cup halfway to his lips. The sound was too loud to be a deer, too deliberate to be natural settling. He set the cup down slowly and brought his rifle up, scanning the tree line above him. Nothing moved. He waited 15 minutes before lowering the weapon. Probably another hunter, he told himself. The mountain was popular during bear season, and sound carried strangely in these hills. Still, he hadn't seen any other vehicles in the parking area, and this spot was well off the main hunting trails. Most hunters stuck to the easier paths closer to the access roads. 20 minutes later, he heard it again. This time the sound was closer, maybe 200 yards, and distinctly different. Not the sharp crack of a breaking branch, but a heavy thud, as if something large had stepped down hard on the forest floor. The sound echoed off the hillside for a moment before the woods fell silent again. Adam's pulse quickened. He knew the sounds of every animal in these mountains, and this wasn't any of them. Bears moved quietly when they weren't running, their paws making soft padding sounds on the earth. Deer were almost silent, unless they were spooked. This was something else entirely. He reached for his cell phone to check if any other hunters had checked in on the hunting forums, but the screen showed no signal. That wasn't unusual. Cell coverage was spotty at best this far into the mountains. He'd have to rely on his radio if he needed to contact anyone. The third sound made his blood run cold. It was a footstep. There was no mistaking it this time. Heavy, deliberate, and accompanied by the soft whisper of something moving through the underbrush. But it was the cadence that frightened him. The sound came at regular intervals, like a person walking, but each footfall was too heavy, too deep. A man Adam's size weighed 190, and he knew exactly what kind of sound his boots made on this terrain. This was something much heavier. Adam tried to rationalize what he was hearing. Maybe another hunter carrying a heavy pack, maybe someone hauling gear up the mountain, but even as he thought it, he knew it wasn't true. He'd been hunting long enough to recognize the distinctive rhythm of a person moving through the woods, and this wasn't it. The steps were too far apart, too widely spaced for human stride. He pulled out his binoculars and began systematically scanning the slope above him. The forest was dense enough that visibility was limited to maybe 50 yards in most directions, but he could see patches of the hillside through gaps in the canopy. Nothing moved except the occasional flutter of leaves in the light breeze. The footsteps stopped. Adam waited, hardly breathing, listening for any sound that might tell him where the unknown presence had gone. The woods had fallen into an unnatural silence. No birds sang, no squirrels chattered. Even the wind seemed to have died away. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath. Then he smelled it. The odor hit him like a physical blow, carried on what little breeze remained. It was unlike anything he'd ever encountered, a mixture of wet fur, decomposition, and something else he couldn't identify. Something wild and musky and wrong. The smell was so strong it made his eyes water, and he had to fight the urge to gag. Adam had field-dressed hundreds of deer and several bears. He'd walked through battlefields in Afghanistan where bodies had been left in the sun for days. He thought he knew what death smelled like, but this was different. This was something alive, something that carried the stench of decay with it. The wind shifted, carrying the smell away, and Adam could breathe again. His hands were shaking as he reached for his rifle. Whatever was up there, it was big. It smelled like nothing that belonged in these woods, and it was moving in his direction. He considered his options. The logical choice was to leave. pack up his gear, hike back to the truck and hunt somewhere else. But Adam had never backed down from anything in his life, and he wasn't about to start now. Besides, he told himself, it was probably just a bear. A big, sick bear that had gotten into something rotten. That would explain the smell and the heavy footsteps. The rationalization lasted exactly 30 seconds. That's when he saw the tree. It was a white pine, maybe 8 inches in diameter, standing about 40 yards up the slope from his position. As Adam watched through his binoculars, the tree began to sway back and forth as if something was pushing against it. But there was no wind, and the movement was too rhythmic, too deliberate to be natural. The tree bent farther with each push until Adam could hear the wood creaking under the stress. Whatever was doing this was incredibly strong. He'd seen bears knock down smaller trees before, but they usually just pushed them over and moved on. This looked almost like play, or worse, like a deliberate display. The swaying stopped as suddenly as it had begun. Adam kept his binoculars trained on the tree, waiting for whatever had been pushing it to show itself. Long minutes passed. His arms began to ache from holding the binoculars steady, but he didn't dare lower them. Something was still up there. He could feel it watching him. Movement caught his eye, but not near the tree. Something dark had shifted position behind a cluster of rhododendron bushes about 60 yards to his left. He swung the binoculars toward the movement and adjusted the focus, trying to make out what he was seeing through the dense foliage. For just a moment, he thought he saw an eye. It was larger than any eye had a right to be, dark brown and clearly intelligent. It seemed to be looking directly at him, studying him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. Adam blinked and refocused the binoculars, but whatever he'd seen was gone. His radio crackled to life, startling him so badly he nearly dropped the binoculars. Any hunters in the Bear Mountain area? This is Game Warden Patterson. We've had reports of aggressive bear activity on the North Slope. Please exercise caution and report any unusual sightings. Adam fumbled for the radio with hands that were now shaking visibly. He keyed the microphone and tried to keep his voice steady. This is Adam Brooks, about 2 miles up the North Slope Trail. I'm seeing some unusual activity up here. What kind of activity, Mr. Brooks? Adam hesitated. How could he explain what he'd been experiencing without sounding like a lunatic? Large animal moving through the area. Heavy footsteps, strong odor, might be a sick bear, but the behavior is strange. Copy that. Can you describe the behavior? Tree shaking, deliberate movement patterns. Whatever it is, it's big and it knows I'm here. There was a pause before the warden responded. Mr. Brooks, if you feel unsafe, please leave the area immediately. We've had 3 reports of unusual bear behavior in the past week, including one incident where a hunter was charged. The animal fled before any shots were fired, but we're treating this as a potentially dangerous situation. Understood. I'll keep you posted. Adam clipped the radio back to his belt and tried to process what he'd just heard. 3 reports of unusual bear behavior. That was unusual in itself. Black bears in Pennsylvania were generally afraid of humans and went out of their way to avoid contact. For multiple hunters to report aggressive behavior suggested something was seriously wrong. He was still thinking about the radio call when he heard the scream. It came from directly uphill, maybe 100 yards away, and it was unlike anything Adam had ever heard. It started low, almost like a moan, then rose in pitch and volume until it became a shriek that seemed to shake the very air around him. The sound went on for nearly 10 seconds before trailing off into something that sounded almost like sobbing. No bear made a sound like that. No animal Adam knew of made a sound like that. He was on his feet before he realized he'd moved, rifle raised and safety off. His heart was hammering against his ribs, and he could taste copper in his mouth. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but his legs felt like lead. The scream had triggered something primal in his brain, some ancient recognition of a predator far more dangerous than anything he was equipped to handle. The woods had gone completely silent again. Even the insects had stopped buzzing. Adam stood frozen behind his makeshift blind, straining his ears for any sound that might tell him where the thing was now. Minutes crawled by like hours. Sweat dripped into his eyes despite the October chill. Then he heard the footsteps again. They were coming down the hill now, moving in his direction. The steps were closer together, as if whatever was making them was picking its way carefully through the underbrush. Adam could hear branches snapping and leaves rustling as something large pushed through the forest. He raised his rifle and peered through the scope, scanning the tree line above him. The crosshairs wavered as his hands shook, and he had to force himself to breathe slowly and deeply. Panic would get him killed. He needed to stay calm, stay focused, and be ready to shoot if whatever was up there proved to be a threat. A shadow moved between the trees. Adam caught it in his peripheral vision and swung the rifle toward it, but whatever he'd seen was gone by the time he got the scope on target. He swept the area slowly, looking for any sign of movement, but the forest might as well have been empty, except for the smell. It was back, stronger than before, carried on a shift in the wind that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The stench was so overpowering that Adam had to breathe through his mouth to keep from retching. It was the smell of something that had been dead for weeks, mixed with the musk of an animal he couldn't identify. That's when he realized the footsteps had stopped. Adam lowered his rifle and looked around frantically. The woods were absolutely silent, but something was wrong with the picture. It took him a moment to figure out what it was. All the shadows were wrong. The sun was higher now, filtering through the canopy at a different angle than it had been an hour ago. But there was one shadow that didn't belong, a dark shape standing between two oak trees about 50 yards uphill from his position. The shadow was too tall to be a bear, too broad to be a person. It stood perfectly still, as if whatever was casting it had been frozen in place. Adam brought his rifle up again and sighted through the scope. The magnification made it easier to see details, and what he saw made his mouth go dry. The shadow had shoulders. Not the rounded shoulders of a bear, but the broad, angular shoulders of something that walked upright. The figure was partially concealed behind the oak trees, but Adam could see enough to know that he was looking at something that shouldn't exist. It was at least 8 feet tall, covered in dark hair or fur, with arms that hung down past its knees. The head was massive, proportioned like a gorilla's, but larger, and it was looking directly at him. Adam could see its eyes now, dark and intelligent, studying him with the same intensity he'd glimpsed earlier through the binoculars. There was no aggression in that gaze, no immediate threat, just curiosity, as if the creature was trying to figure out exactly what kind of animal Adam was. They stared at each other for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Adam's finger hovered over the trigger, but something held him back. The creature wasn't acting aggressively. It was just standing there, watching him. If he shot and missed, or if his shot didn't drop it immediately, he might face a charge from something that outweighed him by several hundred pounds. The creature took a step forward. The movement was fluid, graceful despite the thing's massive size. It emerged from behind the oak trees and stood in plain sight, giving Adam his first clear view of what he was dealing with. It was like looking at something from a nightmare. The creature stood nearly 9 feet tall on 2 legs that were massively muscled and covered in dark brown hair. Its arms were longer than any human's, ending in hands that looked capable of tearing a man apart. The face was a grotesque mixture of human and ape features. A pronounced brow ridge over dark eyes, a flat nose, and a mouth full of teeth that looked designed for tearing flesh. But it was the intelligence in those eyes that terrified Adam the most. This wasn't just some oversized animal. This thing was thinking, calculating, making decisions. It knew exactly what he was and what kind of threat he represented. The creature tilted its head slightly, like a dog hearing a strange sound. Then it opened its mouth and made a noise that was part growl, part grunt, and part something else entirely. The sound was deep and resonant, vibrating through Adam's chest like the bass note of some impossible organ. Adam's finger tightened on the trigger, but before he could fire, the creature turned and melted back into the trees. One moment it was there, solid and terrifying and impossible to miss. The next moment it was gone, leaving only swaying branches to mark its passage. Adam stood frozen for several minutes, rifle still raised, finger still on the trigger. His entire body was shaking now, adrenaline flooding his system as his brain tried to process what he'd just seen. He'd heard stories of Bigfoot sightings in Pennsylvania, of course. Every hunter had, but he'd always dismissed them as tall tales and misidentifications. There was no misidentifying what he'd just seen. The radio crackled again. "Mr. Brooks, this is Warden Patterson. What's your status?" Adam grabbed the radio with hands that were still shaking. I think I need to leave the area. Are you in immediate danger?" Adam looked around at the woods that suddenly seemed alien and hostile. "I don't know, maybe. There's something up here that isn't a bear." "Can you make it back to your vehicle safely?" "I think so. I'm heading down now." "Copy that. I'll meet you at the parking area. Be careful, Mr. Brooks." Adam began gathering his gear with movements that felt sluggish and uncoordinated. His thermos, his binoculars, his day pack, everything seemed to take twice as long as it should. He kept looking over his shoulder, expecting to see the creature watching him from the tree line, but the woods appeared empty. He started down the trail at a pace that was just short of running. Every snapping twig made him jump. Every shadow could be hiding something impossible. The 2-mile hike that had taken him 45 minutes that morning seemed to take forever. Adam was halfway back to the parking area when his cell phone buzzed with a text message. He'd apparently moved back into range of the cell tower. The message was from his wife, Sarah. "How's the hunting? Saw on news that there's been some weird animal attacks in Bradford County. Be careful." He stopped on the trail and stared at the phone. Weird animal attacks. So he wasn't the only one who'd encountered something unusual. He started to type a response, then thought better of it. How could he explain what he'd seen without sounding insane? Instead, he typed back, "Heading home early." Everything's fine. It wasn't fine, and he knew it would never be fine again. The parking area came into view as Adam rounded the last bend in the trail. Warden Patterson's truck was parked next to his pickup, and the warden was leaning against the hood, waiting for him. Patterson was a big man, maybe 6'4", and built like a linebacker, with the kind of calm authority that came from 20 years of dealing with dangerous situations. "Mr. Brooks," Patterson called as Adam approached. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "Something like that," Adam replied, setting his rifle in the truck bed. "Thanks for meeting me here. Tell me what happened up there." Adam took a deep breath and tried to organize his thoughts. "I was in my usual spot, about 2 miles up the North Slope Trail. Started hearing heavy footsteps around 7:30, maybe 8 o'clock. Too heavy to be a person, wrong cadence for a bear. Then there was this smell." "What kind of smell?" "Like death, but worse. Like something that had been rotting for weeks." Adam paused, knowing how crazy his next words would sound. "Then I saw it." Patterson's expression didn't change. "What did you see?" "Something that was about 9 feet tall, covered in hair, walking on 2 legs. It looked at me for maybe 30 seconds, then disappeared back into the woods." The warden was quiet for a long moment, studying Adam's face. "Mr. Brooks, how long have you been hunting these mountains?" 12 years. Ever seen anything like this before?" "Never." Patterson nodded slowly. "You're the 4th hunter this week to report something similar. All different locations, all experienced hunters. Whatever's happening up there, it's got a lot of people spooked. What do you think it is?" The warden shrugged. I don't know. Could be an escaped exotic animal. Could be a bear with some kind of genetic abnormality. Could be mass hysteria. But I'll tell you this. I've been working these mountains for 15 years, and I've never seen anything like what's been described to me this week. Are you going to investigate? Already am. Got a team of wildlife biologists coming in from Penn State tomorrow. If there's something unusual up there, we'll find it. Patterson handed Adam a business card. In the meantime, if you see anything else, call me immediately. And Mr. Brooks, you might want to stay away from the mountain for a while. Adam took the card and nodded. I wasn't planning on coming back anytime soon. The drive home took 40 minutes, but Adam's mind was still back on the mountain. He kept seeing those intelligent eyes, kept hearing that impossible scream. By the time he pulled into his driveway, he'd almost convinced himself that stress and imagination had played tricks on him. Almost. Sarah was waiting for him on the front porch, her face creased with worry. "You're home early," she said as he got out of the truck. "Everything okay?" "Just didn't feel like hunting today," he lied, kissing her cheek. "Thought I'd spend some time with my wife instead." She studied his face with the intensity of someone who'd been married to him for 8 years. "You look pale. Are you feeling all right?" "Just tired." It was a long hike. That evening, Adam found himself glued to the local news, waiting for any mention of unusual animal activity in Bradford County. The lead story was about a proposed casino development. The second story covered a high school football championship. There was nothing about strange creatures or frightened hunters. He switched to the internet and searched for recent Bigfoot sightings in Pennsylvania. To his surprise, he found dozens of reports from the past month alone. Most were dismissed as hoaxes or misidentifications, but the sheer number was staggering. Reports from Monroe County, Lycoming County, Sullivan County, all within 100 miles of Bear Mountain. One report caught his attention. A hiker in Lycoming County had posted photos on a cryptozoology forum, claiming to show massive footprints discovered along a remote trail. The photos were blurry and could have been faked, but the description of the prints matched what Adam would have expected from the creature he'd seen. "What are you reading?" Sarah asked, looking over his shoulder. Adam quickly closed the laptop, just checking hunting regulations for next season. "You're planning next season already?" "You just got back from this season. Never too early to plan ahead." But Adam knew he was lying to himself as much as to his wife. There wouldn't be a next season, not on Bear Mountain. Maybe not anywhere. The thought of going back into the woods, of being alone and vulnerable in places where things like that creature might be watching, made his stomach clench with fear. That night, Adam lay awake, listening to every sound outside the house. A cat yowling in the distance made him sit bolt upright, heart pounding. The settling of the house as temperatures dropped had him reaching for the baseball bat he'd placed beside the bed. Sarah slept peacefully beside him, unaware that her husband was wrestling with the knowledge that everything he'd believed about the world was wrong. Around 3 a.m, he finally drifted off to sleep, only to dream of dark eyes watching him from between the trees. Adam woke the next morning feeling like he'd been hit by a truck. His head ached, his joints were stiff, and his hands still had a faint tremor that he couldn't seem to shake. Sarah was already up, getting ready for her job at the bank. "You were tossing and turning all night," she said, looking at him with concern. "Bad dreams?" "Something like that. Maybe you should see Dr. Henderson. You've been stressed lately." Adam almost laughed. Stressed? If only it were that simple. "I'm fine, honey. Just need some coffee." After Sarah left for work, Adam found himself drawn back to the internet. He spent hours reading about Bigfoot sightings, scientific studies, and first-hand accounts from people who claimed to have encountered the creatures. The more he read, the more convinced he became that what he'd seen was real. But he also discovered something troubling. Many of the people who reported Bigfoot encounters suffered from what researchers termed psychological after-effects. Depression, anxiety, PTSD-like symptoms, relationship problems. Some people became obsessed with finding the creature again. Others, like Adam, developed a crippling fear of the woods. The phone rang, startling him from his research. The caller ID showed Warden Patterson's number. "Mr. Brooks, this is Gary Patterson. I wanted to update you on our investigation." "What did you find?" "We found tracks. Lots of them. Some of the clearest prints I've ever seen. Whatever made them was bipedal, probably weighed between 400 and 600 pounds, and had feet that were at least 17 inches long." Adam felt his mouth go dry. "Any idea what could make tracks like that?" "Nothing that's supposed to exist in Pennsylvania, that's for sure. We're sending casts to the University of Pittsburgh for analysis, but I thought you should know. You definitely saw something unusual up there." After Patterson hung up, Adam sat staring at the phone. Part of him was relieved to have confirmation that he wasn't losing his mind, but another part of him wished the warden had found nothing, wished he could have dismissed the entire experience as stress-induced hallucination. The confirmation made it real, and real meant that somewhere in the mountains of Pennsylvania, something impossible was living and breathing and watching. Over the next few days, Adam tried to return to his normal routine. He went to his job at the county highway department, came home for dinner with Sarah, watched television in the evenings, but everything felt different now, artificial. He found himself constantly looking over his shoulder, jumping at unexpected sounds, avoiding windows after dark. Sarah noticed the changes but attributed them to work stress. Adam let her believe that, knowing that the truth would sound insane. How could he explain that he was afraid to go outside alone, that he'd taken to sleeping with a loaded shotgun beside the bed, that he checked and rechecked the locks on all the doors and windows every night? A week after the encounter, the story finally hit the news. Adam was eating breakfast when Sarah called from the living room. "Honey, you need to see this." He walked in to find her watching the morning news. The anchor was interviewing Warden Patterson, who looked tired and frustrated as he fielded questions about unusual wildlife activity in the state forests. "At this time, we can confirm that multiple hunters have reported encounters with an unidentified large mammal," Patterson was saying. "We're working with wildlife biologists and anthropologists to determine exactly what these individuals may have seen." "Is it true that some witnesses have described the animal as resembling the legendary Bigfoot or Sasquatch?" the anchor asked. Patterson's jaw tightened. "We're not prepared to speculate about the identity of the animal at this time. Our focus is on public safety and determining whether there's any ongoing threat to people using the state forests. But you're not denying the possibility?" "I'm not confirming or denying anything. We're gathering evidence and following proper scientific protocols." The story continued with interviews from some of the other hunters who'd reported encounters. Adam recognized one of them, Bill Kowalski, a local contractor who'd been hunting these mountains longer than Adam had been alive. Bill looked shaken as he described hearing screams that didn't come from any animal I know, and finding trees that had been twisted and broken like toothpicks. "I've been hunting for 40 years, Bill told the camera. "I know every sound these woods make, every animal that lives here. This was something else, something that doesn't belong." After the news segment ended, Sarah turned to Adam with wide eyes. "That's the area where you were hunting last week." Adam nodded, not trusting himself to speak. "Do you think you could have seen whatever they're talking about?" "Maybe," he said carefully. "I did hear some unusual sounds." "Why didn't you tell me?" "I didn't want to worry you. Besides, I wasn't sure what I'd heard." Sarah was quiet for a moment, studying his face. "You've been different since that hunting trip. Jumpy, distracted. What really happened up there?" Adam looked into his wife's concerned eyes and made a decision that would haunt him for years to come. He told her the truth. When he finished his account, Sarah was pale and gripping his hand so tightly her knuckles were white. "Oh my God, Adam. Why didn't you tell me sooner? Because I knew how it would sound." "Hell, I'm still not sure I believe it myself." The warden confirmed the tracks. "Other people have seen it too. You're not crazy." "Sometimes I think crazy would be easier." That afternoon, Adam's phone rang. The caller identified himself as Dr. Marcus Hoffman, an anthropologist from Penn State who was working with the Game Commission on their investigation. "Mr. Brooks, I understand you had a close encounter with the unidentified animal last week. I was hoping you might be willing to meet with me to discuss what you saw." "I already gave my statement to Warden Patterson." "Yes, but I'm interested in the behavioral details you observed. From what I understand, you had one of the clearest sightings we've recorded." Adam hesitated. Part of him wanted to put the entire experience behind him, to never speak of it again. But another part of him knew that might not be possible. If this thing was real, if it was living in the mountains where people hiked and hunted and camped, then maybe someone needed to study it, understand it, figure out how to coexist with it. What do you want to know? Everything. How it moved, how it reacted to your presence, any vocalizations you heard. Details that might help us understand what we're dealing with. They arranged to meet the next day at a coffee shop in town. Dr. Hoffman turned out to be a small, intense man in his 50s with graying hair and sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He listened to Adam's account without interruption, taking notes on a tablet computer. "Fascinating," Hoffman said when Adam finished. "Your description matches several characteristics we'd expect to see in a large primate, but there are some unusual elements." "Such as?" "The intelligence you described, for one thing. The way it studied you seemed to assess the threat you represented. That suggests cognitive abilities well beyond what we see in known great apes." "What do you think it is?" Hoffman leaned back in his chair. "Honestly, I don't know. It could be a relict population of Gigantopithecus, a prehistoric ape that was thought to be extinct. It could be an unknown species of primate that's managed to avoid scientific detection, or it could be something else entirely." "Something else?" "There are theories, unproven, highly speculative theories, about parallel evolution, about species developing along different paths than mainstream science expects. If such a species existed, if it had evolved intelligence comparable to early hominids, it might be smart enough to avoid human contact most of the time." Adam felt a chill run down his spine. "You're talking about something almost human." "I'm talking about something that might be as different from us as we are from chimpanzees, but with intelligence that could rival our own ancestors from 50,000 years ago, smart enough to make tools, to communicate, to plan ahead, but still fundamentally wild, still operating on instincts that we might not understand." That's a terrifying thought. Why? Humans coexisted with Neanderthals for thousands of years. We coexisted with other hominid species. If something like this exists, it's been sharing the planet with us all along. The only difference is that now we know about it. Adam left the coffee shop with more questions than answers. The idea that the creature might be intelligent, might be capable of planning and reasoning, made it even more frightening. At least a wild animal was predictable in its unpredictability. But something with near-human intelligence? That was capable of anything. Over the following weeks, the story gained national attention. Cable news shows featured debates between cryptozoologists and skeptical scientists. Social media exploded with alleged photographs and videos, most of them obvious fakes. The state forests were flooded with Bigfoot hunters, amateur researchers, and curiosity seekers. Adam watched the circus from a distance, refusing all interview requests and avoiding the mountains entirely. He'd seen enough. Whatever was up there, he wanted no part of trying to find it again, but the creature apparently wasn't done with him. It was a Tuesday night in late November when Adam first noticed the tracks in his backyard. He'd let the dog out before bed and was waiting by the back door when Max started barking frantically at something near the tree line. Adam grabbed a flashlight and went to investigate, expecting to find raccoons or maybe a deer. Instead, he found footprints. They were massive, each one sinking deep into the soft earth near his garden. The prints led from the woods to within 20 feet of his house, then back again. Someone, or something, had been watching his home. Adam's hands shook as he followed the trail with his flashlight beam. The prints were exactly like the ones he'd seen described in the news reports. Elongated, with clear toe impressions, and far too large to have been made by any known animal. He called Warden Patterson immediately. "How certain are you about what you're seeing, Mr. Brooks?" "Dead certain. These are the same type of prints you found on the mountain. I'll be there in the morning to take a look. In the meantime, I'd suggest you and your wife stay inside with the doors locked." Adam spent the night sitting by the bedroom window with his shotgun across his knees, watching the tree line for any sign of movement. Sarah had taken one look at the prints and refused to be left alone, huddling next to him with a baseball bat in her hands. "Why would it come here?" she whispered. "Why would it follow you home? I don't know." But Adam suspected he did know, and the knowledge terrified him. Dr. Hoffman had mentioned intelligence, the ability to plan and remember. What if the creature remembered him from the mountain? What if it had somehow tracked him back to his home? The next morning, Patterson arrived with Dr. Hoffman and a team of investigators. They made casts of the prints, took photographs, and searched the woods behind the house for any other signs of the creature's presence. "The prints are authentic," Hoffman confirmed. "Same size and depth as the ones we found on Bear Mountain. Whatever made these tracks weighs between 400 and 600 pounds. "But why here?" Sarah asked. "Why our house?" Hoffman exchanged a look with Patterson. "There's something we haven't told the media," he said slowly. "This isn't the first time we've had reports of these creatures approaching human habitation. There have been 3 other incidents in the past month, all involving people who'd previously encountered them in the wild." Adam felt his blood run cold. "You're saying it's following witnesses?" "We think it might be investigating people who've seen it, learning about them, possibly trying to assess whether they represent a threat." "That's..." Adam couldn't finish the thought. "Highly intelligent behavior," Hoffman said. "The kind of reasoning ability we might expect from early humans." Patterson stepped forward. "Mr. Brooks, I'm going to recommend that you and your wife consider staying somewhere else for a while. At least until we can figure out what we're dealing with. For how long? I don't know. This is uncharted territory for all of us." That afternoon, Adam and Sarah packed bags and drove to her sister's house in Scranton. It was supposed to be a temporary arrangement, just until the authorities could guarantee their safety. But as days turned into weeks, Adam began to realize that they might never be able to go home again. The creature returned to their house twice more, leaving tracks in the yard and what appeared to be hair samples caught on the back fence. Security cameras that Patterson had installed captured shadowy movements at the edge of their property, but nothing clear enough to definitively identify. Adam tried to return to work, but found himself unable to concentrate. Every rustle of leaves, every shadow at the edge of his vision sent him into a panic. His supervisor eventually suggested he take extended leave to deal with his stress. Dr. Hoffman called regularly with updates on the investigation. The creature had been spotted by dozens of people now, but always at a distance, always in situations where clear photography was impossible. It seemed to understand the danger that cameras represented. "We think there might be more than one," Hoffman told Adam during one of their conversations. The behavioral patterns suggest a small population, maybe a family group. They're coordinating their movements, sharing information somehow. Information about what? About us. About the humans who've seen them. They're learning our routines, our habits. It's like they're studying us the same way we're trying to study them. Adam hung up the phone feeling sick. The idea that these creatures might be watching him, learning about him, planning something involving him, was more than he could handle. Christmas came and went without Adam and Sarah returning home. They'd moved from her sister's house to a small apartment in Scranton, close enough that Adam could potentially commute to work, but far enough from the mountains that he felt reasonably safe. But safety, he was learning, was relative. It was New Year's Eve when Adam saw the creature again. He and Sarah were walking back to their apartment from a quiet dinner at a local restaurant. The streets were mostly empty. Scranton wasn't exactly a party town, and most people were celebrating at private gatherings. Adam was fishing for his keys when Sarah grabbed his arm. "Adam," she whispered. "Look." He followed her gaze across the street to a small park that bordered their apartment complex. Something large and dark was standing between the trees, barely visible in the weak light from the street lamps. It was watching them. Adam's heart hammered against his ribs as he recognized the massive silhouette, the two long arms, the intelligent eyes that seemed to glow in the darkness. The creature stood perfectly still, making no effort to hide, as if it wanted them to see it. "Get inside," Adam said, his voice barely a whisper. "Now." They fumbled with the keys, hands shaking so badly it took 3 tries to unlock the door. Once inside, Adam grabbed his phone and called Patterson. "It's here," he said when the warden answered. "In Scranton. It followed us." "Are you certain?" "Dead certain. It's standing across the street from our apartment. Lock your doors and stay inside. I'm sending units immediately." By the time the police arrived, the creature was gone. They found tracks in the soft earth of the park, but nothing else. The officers were polite but skeptical, clearly thinking they were dealing with a pair of delusional civilians who'd been watching too many monster movies. Adam and Sarah packed again that night and drove to Philadelphia, where Sarah's cousin lived. They didn't tell anyone where they were going, didn't use credit cards for gas or food, paid cash for everything. Adam had become convinced that somehow, impossibly, the creature was tracking them. Dr. Hoffman had a different theory. "It's possible," he said when Adam called him from Philadelphia, "that the creature isn't following you in the traditional sense. These animals might have a much more sophisticated understanding of human behavior than we realized. If they've been observing us for generations, learning our patterns, they might be able to predict where someone would go when they're frightened." "You're saying it knew we'd come here?" "I'm saying it might understand that humans have social networks, places they go when they need help. It might have observed enough human behavior to make educated guesses about your likely destinations." The thought was even more terrifying than being actively hunted. It suggested a level of intelligence that approached human reasoning, combined with knowledge of human society accumulated over decades or centuries of secret observation. Adam spent the next 3 months in Philadelphia, jumping at shadows and avoiding any news coverage of the ongoing Bigfoot investigation. He'd given Dr. Hoffman permission to share his story with other researchers, hoping that his experience might help someone else understand what they were dealing with. But he wanted no part of the media circus that had erupted around the creature's existence. Television crews had descended on Bradford County like locusts, turning the serious scientific investigation into a carnival of sensationalism and exploitation. In March, Warden Patterson called with news. "We think they've moved on," he said. "No new sightings in Pennsylvania for over a month. The last confirmed tracks were found near the New York border, heading north." "What does that mean?" "It means you might be able to come home. We'll maintain increased patrols in your area for a while, just as a precaution, but it looks like whatever brought them to Pennsylvania has passed." Adam and Sarah returned to their house on a grey April morning, both of them nervous and jumping at every sound. The place felt alien after months away, as if it belonged to someone else. Adam walked through every room with his shotgun in hand, checking closets and looking under beds like a child afraid of monsters. Because that's what he was now. A grown man, terrified of things that supposedly didn't exist. They tried to resume their normal lives. Sarah returned to her job at the bank. Adam went back to work for the highway department, but everything was different now. Adam couldn't enjoy the woods anymore, couldn't go hunting or hiking or camping. The sight of trees clustering together reminded him of dark eyes watching from the shadows. He sold his rifles and hunting gear, claiming he'd lost interest in the sport. Sarah knew better, but didn't push him to explain. Some wounds, she'd learned, were too deep for easy healing. Dr. Hoffman published a paper about the Pennsylvania sightings, focusing on the behavioral evidence for high intelligence in unknown primate species. Adam was quoted anonymously, his descriptions of the creature's apparent reasoning abilities cited as evidence for complex cognitive processes. The paper was largely ignored by mainstream science and dismissed as pseudoscientific speculation. But it found an audience among cryptozoologists and researchers who'd been documenting similar encounters for decades. Adam read the paper once and then tried to forget about it. He'd contributed what he could to human understanding of these creatures. Now he just wanted to be left alone. But late at night, when the house creaked and settled around him, he still found himself listening for heavy footsteps in the darkness. And sometimes, when he looked out his bedroom window at the tree line beyond his backyard, he thought he could see eyes looking back at him. Whether those eyes were real or imagined, Adam never tried to find out. Some questions, he'd learned, were better left unanswered. The official investigation was quietly closed 6 months later, with authorities concluding that multiple witnesses had likely encountered a large, unidentified animal, possibly a bear with unusual characteristics. No definitive evidence of an unknown species was found, and interest gradually faded as the media moved on to other stories. Adam kept Dr. Hoffman's business card in his wallet, along with Warden Patterson's contact information, just in case. But he never called either man again, and they never called him. As far as the world was concerned, the Pennsylvania Bigfoot flap of 2023 was just another unexplained mystery, filed away with UFO sightings and ghost stories. The truth was more complex and more terrifying than most people could handle. Adam Brooks knew the truth. He'd looked into the eyes of something that shouldn't exist and lived to tell about it. But telling and being believed were two different things, and he'd learned that some experiences were too strange for words. He still lived in Bradford County, still worked for the highway department, still loved his wife, and tried to live a normal life. But part of him would always be standing in those woods, staring into dark eyes that held an intelligence older and more alien than anything human science was prepared to acknowledge. And somewhere in the mountains of Pennsylvania, or perhaps somewhere else entirely, those eyes might still be watching, still learning, still waiting for the next encounter between two species that were never meant to meet. On quiet nights, when the wind moved through the trees behind his house, Adam sometimes thought he could hear them calling to each other in voices that sounded almost human. But he never looked to confirm what he was hearing. Some things were better left unknown. 3 years later, Adam still checked the locks on his doors twice before bed, still kept a loaded shotgun in his bedroom closet, and still refused to enter the woods alone. He'd told Dr. Henderson, his family physician, that he suffered from anxiety following a traumatic incident while hunting. The doctor prescribed medication and recommended counseling, both of which helped with the symptoms but couldn't erase the memories. Sarah had suggested they move away from Pennsylvania, start fresh somewhere without mountains or forests or memories of impossible creatures. But Adam refused. Running hadn't helped before, and it wouldn't help now. This was his home, his life, and he wouldn't let fear drive him away from everything he'd built. Besides, he'd come to understand something that Dr. Hoffman's research had only hinted at. The creatures weren't the real problem. The real problem was living with knowledge that challenged everything humanity believed about itself and its place in the world. Adam Brooks had seen the future of a species that had learned to coexist with humans by remaining invisible, by adapting and evolving and surviving in the spaces between human awareness and human understanding. They were the real success story of evolution, not the hunters who'd conquered the world, but the hunted who'd learned to thrive in its shadows. And that knowledge, more than any creature lurking in the woods, was what kept him awake at night. The last entry in Adam's hunting journal, written 3 years after his encounter, read simply, "Some things are better left undisturbed. Today I threw away my hunting license. I'm done with the woods." But the woods, as Adam would discover, might not be done with him. On a cold October morning, exactly 4 years after his first encounter, Adam was driving to work when he saw something that made him pull over to the side of the road. There, in the muddy shoulder beside Route 14, was a single footprint, large, deep, and unmistakably familiar. Adam sat in his truck for 20 minutes, staring at the print and trying to decide what to do. Finally, he picked up his phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in 3 years. "Dr. Hoffman? This is Adam Brooks. I think we need to talk. Because some stories, Adam realized, never really end. They just wait for the next chapter to begin." The next case. The Arkansas encounter. Noah Carter had been hunting the Cache River bottoms for 15 years, ever since his divorce, and he'd never seen anything that made him question his sanity until that October morning when the fog hung thick as cotton over the black water. The 38-year-old plumber from Jonesboro knew every cypress stump, every fallen log, every hidden slough in this stretch of the White River National Wildlife Refuge. He'd grown up hearing the old-timers' stories about strange sounds and glimpses of something massive moving through the timber. But Noah was a practical man who believed in what he could touch, measure, and fix with his hands. The alarm on his phone buzzed at 4:30, though he'd been awake for 20 minutes, listening to the October wind rattle the windows of his apartment. Sleep had been elusive lately, ever since the plant had announced layoffs and his ex-wife had started making noise about increasing child support payments. The duck season opener couldn't have come at a better time. He needed the solitude, the ritual of setting decoys and calling birds, the simple satisfaction of a clean shot and a good retrieve. Noah loaded his gear into the back of his 12-year-old Ford F-150, the truck's odometer showing 180,000 miles of hard living. His 16-foot aluminum boat sat on the trailer behind it, the same rig his father had used before the cancer took him. The Remington 870 was cleaned and oiled, shells loaded in his vest, thermos filled with black coffee that would have to substitute for the sleep he'd missed. He'd packed enough food for 2 days, planning to camp at the boat launch if the hunting was good. The drive from Jonesboro to the Dagmar access took 45 minutes through countryside that looked alien in the pre-dawn darkness. Noah's headlights cut through patches of fog that seemed to reach across the road like grasping fingers. The radio crackled with static between stations, picking up distant signals that faded in and out. He settled on a little rock AM station playing country music from the 70s, Hank Williams Jr. singing about a country boy surviving. At the boat ramp, Noah was surprised to find himself alone. Opening day usually brought at least a dozen trucks and trailers, local hunters eager to test their skills against the mallards and wood ducks that funneled through the Arkansas flyway. But the gravel parking area sat empty except for his own truck. the surface scattered with dead leaves that whispered in the wind. The single security light cast a pale circle that seemed to push back against something vast and dark beyond its reach. Noah backed his trailer down the concrete ramp, the boat sliding into water that looked black as oil in the dim light. The engine started on the third pull, settling into the familiar, puttering idle that had been the soundtrack to countless hunting trips. He secured the truck and trailer, grabbed his gear, and pushed off into the channel that led deeper into the refuge. The fog closed around him like a living thing as soon as he left the launch area. Noah had navigated these waters in similar conditions before, relying on memory and the occasional glimpse of a familiar landmark. But something felt different this morning. The usual sounds were wrong. No owls called from the timber, no beavers slapped their tails in the distance. Even the gentle lapping of water against the boat hull seemed muffled, as if the fog were absorbing every sound. He'd planned to set up in a slough about 2 miles from the ramp, a spot that had produced limits of mallards for the past 3 seasons. But as he rounded the bend, where Cane Creek emptied into the main channel, his trolling motor suddenly quit. The silence that followed was absolute, pressing against his eardrums like deep water. Noah pulled the starter cord on his main engine, but it refused to turn over. He tried again, then checked the fuel line, the spark plug connection, everything he could think of in the pre-dawn gloom. On the 4th attempt, the engine coughed to life with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the oppressive quiet. Noah didn't question his luck, steering toward the slough entrance, marked by 2 towering cypress trees that stood like sentinels in the mist. He'd hunted from this spot so many times he could set his decoys in complete darkness. And he did exactly that, placing a dozen mallard blocks in a rough J pattern that would funnel birds into range. His makeshift blind sat at the base of a massive cypress, whose trunk measured at least 8 feet in diameter. Noah had built the hide from natural materials over several seasons, weaving branches and brush into a screen that looked like part of the swamp itself. He settled into the familiar seat he'd carved from a section of fallen log, arranged his gear within easy reach, and waited for shooting light. That's when he first noticed the smell. It wasn't the usual swamp odor of decay and stagnant water. This was something else, something organic but wrong, like wet fur mixed with the metallic scent of fresh blood. The wind was calm, barely moving the fog, so the smell seemed to hang in the air around his blind. Noah checked his boots, thinking he might have stepped in something on the way from the boat, but the odor didn't seem to be coming from him. Legal shooting time arrived with the gradual graying of the fog rather than any clear sunrise. Noah could see perhaps 30 yards in any direction, his decoys appearing and disappearing like ghosts as the mist shifted. He'd hunted in worse visibility, but the continuing silence bothered him. No ducks whistled overhead, no coots called from the deeper water. The swamp felt empty in a way that violated 15 years of experience. The first duck appeared without warning, materializing from the fog like something conjured from his imagination. It was a drake mallard, green head gleaming despite the lack of direct sunlight, and it dropped into his decoys with the confidence of a bird that had never seen a hunter. Noah raised his shotgun, led the target as it swam across the opening in his spread, and fired. The shot echoed strangely in the fog, the sound seeming to bounce back from invisible walls. The mallard folded cleanly, floating among the decoys in a small circle of ripples. Noah waited, listening for the wing beats of other birds that might have been drawn by the calling, but the silence returned immediately and completely. He was about to wade out to retrieve the duck when he heard something that made him freeze with 1 foot in the water. It was a splash, but not the gentle sound of a duck landing or a beaver surfacing. This was the sound of something large moving through the water with purpose, coming from the direction of his downed bird. Noah strained his eyes against the fog, trying to see what was causing the disturbance. The water around his decoys began to move in ways that didn't make sense, ripples spreading outward from a point he couldn't see. Then one of his decoys disappeared, pulled under so quickly he might have imagined it. "What the hell?" he whispered, the words seeming to die in the thick air before they could travel more than a few feet. Another decoy vanished, then another. Something was moving systematically through his spread, but Noah couldn't see what. The fog seemed to thicken as he watched, reducing his visibility to just a few yards. He could hear water moving, the gentle lapping sound of something large displacing the surface, but the source remained invisible. When the fog finally shifted enough for him to see clearly, all of his decoys were gone, except for the dead mallard, which floated alone in the center of an empty circle of dark water. Noah stood slowly, his hand instinctively checking for the reassuring weight of his cell phone in his vest pocket. No signal, as expected this deep in the refuge, but the familiar device provided some small comfort. He was debating whether to wade out for the duck or retreat to his boat when the water near the mallard suddenly erupted. Something massive breached the surface, sending waves in all directions, but the fog closed again before Noah could process what he'd seen. When it cleared, both the duck and whatever had taken it were gone. Noah's hands shook as he gathered his remaining gear, his mind struggling to rationalize what he'd witnessed. Large gars sometimes rolled near the surface, and alligators weren't unheard of this far north, especially in warm October weather. But nothing he'd ever seen in these waters could have moved like that with such deliberate intent. He pushed his boat away from the blind, using the electric trolling motor to move quietly toward the main channel. The fog seemed to follow him, maintaining its grip on visibility, but Noah knew these waters well enough to navigate by memory. He planned to try another spot, maybe the Oxbow Lake where he'd had success during the previous season. As he rounded a bend in the channel, the fog suddenly lifted like a theater curtain, revealing a landscape that looked different from the one he'd entered hours earlier. The familiar landmarks were all wrong. The dead snag where he'd always seen wood ducks perching was gone. The beaver lodge that marked the entrance to Lost Slough had vanished. Even the cypress trees seemed taller and older, their Spanish moss hanging in curtains that hadn't been there before. Noah stopped the boat and pulled out his GPS unit, waiting for it to acquire satellites. The small screen showed his location as a blue dot in the middle of what appeared to be solid ground, miles from any mapped waterway. He turned the unit off and on again, but the reading remained the same. According to the GPS, he was sitting in his boat in the middle of a dry field. "Piece of junk," he muttered, stuffing the GPS back into his tackle box. Electronics failed in the swamp all the time, especially in heavy fog. He'd rely on his knowledge of the area to find his way back to familiar water. But as he continued deeper into the refuge, nothing looked right. Channels he'd navigated hundreds of times seemed to lead in impossible directions. Sloughs that should have been shallow enough to wade across dropped away into black depths that his anchor line couldn't reach. The fog continued to move independently of any wind, sometimes lifting to reveal panoramic views of unfamiliar territory, sometimes pressing close enough to hide his own hands on the boat's tiller. An hour after legal shooting time began, Noah finally saw another duck. It was a wood duck hen, flying low and fast through a gap in the canopy. He raised his gun and led the bird carefully, squeezing the trigger as it passed directly overhead. The duck crumpled and fell into a patch of open water about 40 yards away. As Noah motored toward the downed bird, he noticed ripples spreading outward from where it had landed, as if something had disturbed the water from below. He approached cautiously, peering into the dark surface, trying to spot the wood duck's distinctive plumage. The ripples continued to spread, growing larger rather than smaller, suggesting that whatever had caused them was still moving. Then the water exploded. Something erupted from beneath the surface with tremendous force, sending a geyser of black water high into the air. Noah caught a glimpse of massive shoulders covered in dark, matted fur before spray obscured his vision. When it cleared, he found himself staring at a creature that shouldn't exist. It stood in water that barely reached its knees, at least 8 feet tall, with arms that hung nearly to the waterline. Its face was a disturbing mixture of human and ape features, with intelligent eyes that seemed to glow with their own light in the grey morning. Dark fur covered its entire body, hanging in wet clumps that dripped steadily into the swamp. The smell that had bothered Noah earlier now hit him with overwhelming intensity, a mixture of wet animal and something deeply unpleasant he couldn't identify. The creature held Noah's wood duck in one massive hand, examining it with what appeared to be curiosity rather than hunger. Water streamed from its fur as it turned its attention to the hunter, and Noah felt his blood freeze as those glowing eyes fixed on his. For a moment that seemed to stretch for hours, neither moved. The creature's chest rose and fell with slow, deliberate breathing, its gaze never wavering from Noah's face. Then it spoke. Not in words, but in a sound that came from deep in its chest, a low rumbling that vibrated through the water and into Noah's bones. It was a sound of territorial claim, of warning, of something that had been disturbed in its domain. The creature lifted the duck higher, as if displaying its prize, then slowly and deliberately closed its fist. Feathers drifted down to the water's surface like brown snow. Noah's hand moved instinctively toward his shotgun, but something in the creature's posture warned him against any aggressive action. Instead, he reached slowly for the boat's throttle, preparing to retreat as carefully as possible. The creature watched his every movement, its head tilted slightly to one side, like a dog trying to understand human behavior. When Noah finally started the engine, the creature didn't flinch. If anything, it seemed to approve of his decision to leave. It waded backward until the water reached its waist, then its chest, then its shoulders. Finally, only its head remained visible above the surface, those glowing eyes tracking Noah's retreat until the fog swallowed both of them. Noah didn't remember the trip back to the main channel. One moment he was staring at the spot where the creature had vanished. The next, he was idling through fog so thick he couldn't see the bow of his own boat. His hands shook as he gripped the tiller, and sweat mixed with the moisture from the fog to soak his hunting jacket despite the cool morning air. He tried to rationalize what he'd seen. Hallucination brought on by stress and lack of sleep. A bear, maybe, standing upright in the water, his imagination amplifying a perfectly normal encounter with local wildlife into something impossible. But the smell lingered in his nostrils, and the memory of those eyes refused to fade. The fog began to lift as Noah finally found water he recognized, revealing the familiar landmarks of Cane Creek. His GPS unit suddenly acquired satellites and showed him exactly where he should be, as if the electronic confusion had been caused by nothing more than atmospheric interference. Noah felt a surge of relief as he headed back toward the boat ramp, eager to reach solid ground and the safety of his truck. But as he rounded the final bend before the launch area, he found his path blocked. A massive tree had fallen across the narrow channel, its trunk easily 4 feet in diameter. Noah knew this tree, an ancient cypress that had stood sentinel at this spot for as long as he could remember. It had been healthy the day before, showing no signs of disease or storm damage. Yet here it lay, blocking his escape route as effectively as a gate. The tree was too large to move and too high to climb over with the boat. Noah would have to backtrack to another channel, adding hours to his trip home. But as he prepared to turn around, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. The tree hadn't fallen naturally. The trunk showed clear signs of having been pushed over with tremendous force, the root ball torn from the earth rather than gradually undermined by erosion. Long scratches marked the bark, gouges too deep and too wide to have been made by any animal Noah knew. They looked almost like claw marks, but scaled up to a size that suggested something with hands the size of baseball mitts. The scratches were fresh, sap still oozing from the deepest cuts. Noah sat in his boat, staring at the evidence of impossible strength, when he heard something that made his scalp crawl. It was the same rumbling sound the creature had made, but coming from multiple directions at once. The fog, which had been lifting steadily, suddenly thickened again, reducing visibility to mere yards. Shapes moved in the mist, too large and too upright to be any known animal. Noah counted at least 3 distinct forms, possibly more, circling his position at a distance that kept them just beyond clear sight. The rumbling continued, a conversation in a language he couldn't understand, but that conveyed unmistakable menace. Noah's first instinct was to grab his shotgun, but 3 shells seemed inadequate against creatures that could uproot ancient trees. Instead, he started his engine and backed away from the fallen cypress, looking for another route to open water. The shapes in the fog moved with him, maintaining their distance but making it clear that he was being herded in a specific direction. The channel they forced him to take led deeper into the refuge, away from the safety of the boat ramp. Noah knew this area less well, but he remembered it as a dead-end slough that terminated in a wall of impenetrable timber. If the creatures were driving him toward a trap, they had chosen their route carefully. As the fog thinned again, Noah caught clearer glimpses of his escorts. They moved through the water with surprising grace for their size, staying low to minimize their profile, but occasionally rising to their full height to check his position. Their coordination suggested intelligence far beyond any known primate, a level of tactical thinking that made Noah's situation feel increasingly hopeless. The slough narrowed as he proceeded, forcing him closer to his pursuers. Noah could smell them now, that same mixture of wet fur and decay that had first alerted him to their presence. One of them called out, a series of shorter vocalizations that sounded almost like words, and was answered by similar calls from the others. They were communicating, planning, coordinating their movements with the precision of a military unit. When the slough finally opened into the dead-end lake, Noah remembered, he found himself facing a wall of cypress trees that rose from water too deep to pole and too choked with fallen timber to navigate. His escorts emerged from the fog as he approached the far shore, revealing themselves fully for the first time. There were 4 of them, each standing 8 to 9 feet tall, with the massive build and powerful limbs Noah had seen in the first encounter. Their faces showed a disturbing range of expressions, from curious to hostile to something that looked almost like amusement. The largest stood in the center, clearly the dominant individual, while the others took positions that blocked any possible escape route. The leader waded forward until it stood just outside the range of Noah's boat, close enough that he could see the individual hairs of its fur and the way water droplets caught the filtered sunlight. It studied him with obvious intelligence, its head tilted in a gesture that seemed almost human. Then it opened its mouth and made a sound that chilled Noah to his core. It was laughter, not the hooting call of an ape or the bark of a territorial predator, but actual laughter, deep and rumbling and filled with genuine amusement. The creature found Noah's situation funny, his fear entertaining, his helplessness a source of obvious pleasure. The others joined in, creating a chorus of inhuman mirth that echoed off the surrounding trees. Noah's nerve finally broke. He yanked the throttle to full speed and aimed his boat directly at the smallest gap between 2 of the creatures, hoping to break through their line before they could react. For a moment he thought he might succeed. The boat leaped forward, its aluminum hull cutting through the dark water toward a narrow opening between 2 surprised creatures. But they moved faster than anything that large should have been able to move. The 2 guards stepped together, closing the gap, and one of them grabbed the bow of Noah's boat as it passed. The impact nearly threw him overboard, the sudden stop whipping his body forward against the steering console with enough force to drive the air from his lungs. The creature that had caught his boat lifted the bow completely out of the water, tilting the stern down until Noah had to grab the sides to keep from sliding backward into the lake. Water poured over the transom, flooding the bilge and soaking his equipment. His shotgun, tackle box, and thermos all slid toward the back of the boat, now beyond his reach. The creature holding his bow made eye contact, its expression no longer amused. This close, Noah could see that its eyes weren't glowing with their own light, as he'd first thought, but were simply more reflective than human eyes, like those of a nocturnal animal. Intelligence burned in those eyes. But it was alien intelligence, operating by rules Noah couldn't understand. For several seconds, the creature simply held the boat, studying its captive. Noah could smell its breath, a mixture of fish and something sweetly rotten. He could see old scars on its arms and shoulders, evidence of a hard life in an unforgiving environment. This wasn't some mythical being or supernatural entity. It was flesh and blood, an animal adapted to a lifestyle that had kept it hidden from human contact for centuries. When the creature finally released the boat, it did so without warning. The bow crashed back into the water, sending up a splash that soaked Noah and startled him into falling backward onto his gear. By the time he regained his balance, all four creatures had vanished into the fog as silently as they had appeared. Noah sat in his partially flooded boat, surrounded by an emptiness that felt more complete than mere solitude. The fog began to lift again, revealing the familiar landmarks of the dead-end slough, but nothing indicated that the creatures had ever been there. No tracks in the muddy shallows, no broken vegetation, no lingering scent. It was as if the entire encounter had been a stress-induced hallucination, brought on by too little sleep and too much caffeine. But his boat was still partially flooded, and his gear was still scattered across the stern. Noah spent several minutes bailing water and reorganizing his equipment, tasks that gave his hands something to do while his mind struggled to process what had happened. The creatures had been real. He was certain of that. But they had also demonstrated a level of intelligence and coordination that challenged everything he thought he knew about the natural world. As he prepared to leave the slough, Noah noticed something floating near the shoreline that hadn't been there before. It was his wood duck, the one the first creature had crushed in its fist. But the bird was intact, unmarked except for the original shot that had brought it down. It floated on its side in perfect condition, as if it had just fallen from the sky. Noah stared at the duck for a long moment, trying to understand what its presence meant. Had the creatures retrieved it from wherever it had been taken? Was this some kind of peace offering, a gesture that indicated their intentions weren't entirely hostile, or was it simply evidence that his memory of the encounter was already becoming unreliable? He used his landing net to retrieve the duck, examining it carefully for any sign of damage beyond his original shot. The bird was pristine, its feathers dry despite having been submerged, its body temperature suggesting it had only recently died. Noah placed it carefully in his cooler, the first and only duck he would take from this hunting trip. The trip back to the boat ramp passed without incident, the fog finally lifting completely to reveal a normal October morning in the Arkansas swamp. The fallen tree that had blocked his original escape route was gone, not a trace remaining to suggest it had ever existed. The channel flowed clear and unobstructed, just as it had every other time Noah had used this route. At the boat ramp, Noah was surprised to find several other trucks and trailers in the parking area. Hunters were loading boats and checking equipment, preparing for their own morning hunts. They nodded and waved as Noah pulled his boat from the water, offering the casual greetings common among people who shared the same passion. "Any luck out there?" asked an older man with a full grey beard, the kind of hunter who'd been working these waters since before Noah was born. "Just one duck," Noah replied, his voice sounding strange to his own ears. Tough morning, with all that fog. What fog? The man asked, looking genuinely confused. Been clear as a bell since before dawn. Perfect duck weather. Noah stared at him, then looked back across the water he'd just left. The sky was cloudless, the air crisp and transparent, with visibility extending for miles across the refuge. There was no sign of the fog that had dominated his entire morning, no hint of the atmospheric conditions that had hidden the creatures from view. Must have been thinking of yesterday, Noah said finally, loading his gear with hands that refused to stop shaking. The drive home passed in a blur of familiar countryside that looked subtly different, as if he was seeing it through glass that distorted shapes and colors just enough to be noticeable. Noah kept the radio turned off, needing the silence to process what had happened, but his thoughts circled uselessly around the central impossibility of the morning's events. By the time he reached his apartment in Jonesboro, Noah had almost convinced himself that the entire experience had been some kind of waking dream brought on by stress and fatigue. The lack of any physical evidence beyond the single duck made the rational explanation seem more plausible. He'd been hunting alone in poor visibility, his mind had played tricks on him, and memory had transformed a series of mundane events into something extraordinary. But when he cleaned the wood duck that evening, he found something that shattered his carefully constructed rationalization. Embedded in the bird's breast meat, just beneath the skin, was a single hair. It was 6 inches long, coarse and dark, unlike any feather or plant fiber Noah had ever seen. Under his desk lamp, the hair seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and it carried a faint but unmistakable odor of wet fur and decay. Noah sat at his kitchen table, holding the hair up to the light, trying to convince himself it came from some ordinary source. A dog, maybe, or a wild hog. But he knew better. The hair was too long, too coarse, too alien to have come from any known animal. It was physical proof that his encounter had been real, evidence that something impossible had touched his world and left a trace behind. He wrapped the hair carefully in a paper towel and placed it in a sealed plastic bag, then put the bag in his freezer next to the rest of the duck meat. He would decide later what to do with it, if anything. For now, it was enough to know that he hadn't lost his mind, that the creatures in the fog had been as real as the morning itself. Sleep came with difficulty that night, and when it finally arrived, it brought dreams of glowing eyes and rumbling laughter that echoed through landscapes of endless fog. Noah woke several times, checking the locks on his doors and windows, listening for sounds that didn't belong to the urban night outside his apartment. Each time he drifted back to sleep, the dreams returned, more vivid and disturbing than before. The next morning brought phone calls he'd been dreading, but knew were inevitable. His ex-wife wanted to discuss their son's upcoming birthday party. His supervisor at the plumbing company needed him to cover a Saturday shift. The mundane demands of normal life pressed in from all sides, making the previous day's events seem even more surreal by comparison. Noah went through the motions of his regular routine, but everything felt different. Coffee tasted wrong. The morning news seemed to come from another world. Even his reflection in the bathroom mirror looked like a stranger, someone who'd seen things that changed the way light hit his face. He tried to call his brother in Little Rock, thinking he might share the story with someone who'd known him long enough to judge his sanity, but the words wouldn't come. How could he explain what had happened without sounding like someone who needed professional help? The rational part of his mind knew that telling the story would only invite questions he couldn't answer, and skepticism he couldn't counter. Instead, Noah found himself researching cryptozoology websites and reading accounts of similar encounters from around the country. The stories all had familiar elements: fog that appeared from nowhere, electronics that failed for no reason, creatures that displayed impossible intelligence and coordination. But the online accounts also contained too many obvious fabrications and attention-seeking embellishments for Noah to take them seriously. His story would join the ranks of unverifiable tales told by people who claimed extraordinary experiences, but could offer only their word as proof. The hair in his freezer might convince a laboratory technician, but Noah knew that even DNA evidence could be explained away as contamination or hoax. The truth would remain locked inside his own memory, isolated and unshared. The following weekend, Noah drove back to the refuge, telling himself he was going to try for more ducks, but knowing he was really looking for some sign that the encounter had been real. The boat ramp bustled with hunters preparing for another day on the water, their enthusiasm a sharp contrast to Noah's nervous energy. He launched his boat and retraced his route from the previous week, navigating by GPS to the exact coordinates where he'd first seen the creature. The location looked completely ordinary in bright sunlight, just another piece of Arkansas swampland dotted with cypress trees and bordered by thick timber. No lingering odors, no unusual sounds, no sense of being watched by hidden eyes. Noah anchored his boat and called for ducks using the same sequence that had drawn the wood duck the week before. Several birds responded, circling his decoys and showing interest, but none committed to landing. After an hour of fruitless calling, he gave up and tried a different location. The entire day passed without incident, productive enough to fill his limit with mallards and teal, but disappointingly normal in every other respect. Noah found himself almost hoping for another encounter, some confirmation that he hadn't imagined the whole experience. But the swamp kept its secrets, offering nothing more than good hunting and beautiful weather. That evening, as Noah cleaned his ducks in his apartment kitchen, he made a decision that surprised him with its certainty. He wrapped the strange hair from the previous week's duck in several layers of plastic and tape, creating a package that would preserve it indefinitely. Then he wrote a detailed account of his encounter, including every detail he could remember, and sealed both items in a safety deposit box at his bank. If anyone ever found physical evidence of the creatures he'd encountered, Noah's account would be waiting as corroboration. If similar reports ever emerged from the same area, investigators would have a paper trail leading back to that foggy October morning. It wasn't much, but it was something, a hedge against the possibility that the truth might eventually matter to someone besides himself. In the weeks that followed, Noah found his life settling into new patterns that accommodated the reality of what he'd experienced. He continued hunting, but never alone, and never in that particular section of the refuge. He avoided discussing cryptozoology or unusual wildlife encounters, but he paid attention when others brought up such topics. Most importantly, he stopped trying to convince himself that the morning in the fog had been anything other than exactly what it seemed. The creatures were real. They lived in the deep places where humans rarely ventured, maintaining their secrecy through intelligence, coordination, and an understanding of human behavior that bordered on the supernatural. They tolerated occasional intrusions into their territory, but they also made it clear that such tolerance had limits. Noah had crossed those limits and been allowed to leave with a warning. He had no intention of testing their patience again. The duck season ended without Noah returning to the scene of his encounter, though he found himself driving past the Dagmar access road several times during the winter months. Each time, he felt a pull toward the water, a curiosity about what else might be hidden in the fog-shrouded depths of the refuge. But stronger than curiosity was the memory of those glowing eyes and rumbling laughter, the certainty that some doors, once opened, could never be safely closed again. Spring brought new concerns as flooding inundated much of the Arkansas River Valley, displacing both wildlife and people from their normal habitats. Noah wondered if the creatures he'd encountered were affected by the rising water, if they might be forced to move into areas where human contact would be unavoidable. But the news reported nothing unusual, no sightings or encounters that suggested anything extraordinary was happening in the flooded bottomlands. Summer passed quietly, with Noah working overtime to help repair flood damage throughout central Arkansas. The physical labor and long hours provided a welcome distraction from thoughts of his encounter, though certain triggers could still transport him back to that foggy morning with startling clarity. The smell of wet fur on a rainy day, the sight of fog rising from warm water, the sound of something large moving through brush just beyond the range of vision. Each incident left him shaken, but also oddly grateful. The experience had changed him in ways that weren't entirely negative. He paid more attention to his surroundings now, noticed details that would have escaped him before. He felt more connected to the natural world, more aware of its mysteries and hidden depths. If the price of that awareness was occasional moments of primal terror, Noah found it a trade he could accept. The following duck season arrived with unusually warm weather that kept the birds scattered and the hunting difficult. Noah partnered with different hunters throughout the season, but he found their company less satisfying than his previous solitary trips. They talked too much, moved too carelessly, and seemed oblivious to the subtle signs that something was watching from the shadows. Noah knew he was being watched. Not constantly and not everywhere, but often enough that he'd learned to recognize the feeling. It wasn't paranoia or imagination. Something was keeping track of his movements, monitoring his behavior, perhaps ensuring that he kept the bargain he'd made in that fog-bound slough. The awareness should have been frightening, but Noah found it oddly comforting. As long as he felt those hidden eyes upon him, he knew the creatures were still there, still real, still protecting their secrets in the deep places of the Arkansas wilderness. Their presence validated his sanity and his memory, providing ongoing proof that the world contained wonders and terrors beyond normal human experience. On the last day of duck season, exactly 1 year after his encounter, Noah made a decision that had been building in his mind for months. He drove to the Dagmar access alone, launched his boat in the pre-dawn darkness, and navigated by memory to the dead-end slough where he'd been trapped the year before. The morning was clear and cold, with none of the fog that had characterized his previous visit. Noah anchored his boat in the exact spot where the creatures had surrounded him, then opened his cooler and removed a single item he'd brought for this specific purpose. It was a mallard drake, farm-raised, and purchased from a meat market in Little Rock. Noah placed the duck carefully on the water's surface, then backed his boat away to a respectful distance. He didn't call out or make any attempt to attract attention. He simply waited, watching the drake float in the center of the slough like an offering placed on an altar. For an hour, nothing happened. The sun rose higher, burning off the last wisps of fog and revealing a perfectly ordinary piece of swampland. Noah began to think his gesture would go unnoticed, that the creatures had moved on or lost interest in the human who'd stumbled into their world. Then the water near the duck began to ripple, and Noah knew he was no longer alone. The creature that surfaced was the same one he'd first encountered, or at least one very similar to it. It approached the floating duck cautiously, studying it from several angles before gently lifting it from the water. The creature's eyes found Noah across the distance that separated them, and for a moment that stretched into eternity, they regarded each other in silence. Finally, the creature nodded once, a gesture so human and so unmistakable that Noah felt tears spring to his eyes. It was acknowledgement, acceptance, perhaps even a form of gratitude. The creature understood that Noah had returned not as a hunter or intruder, but as someone seeking to make amends for his previous trespass. The creature sank slowly beneath the surface, taking the duck with it, and did not reappear. Noah waited another hour, but the slough remained empty and peaceful, offering no further signs of the intelligence that dwelt beneath its dark waters. On the drive home, Noah felt a sense of completion that had been missing from his life for the past year. He'd honored his obligation to the creatures that had spared him, acknowledging their dominance over the hidden places of their world. The encounter was closed, the debt paid, the relationship defined within parameters both sides could accept. Noah never returned to that section of the refuge, but he continued to hunt other areas throughout Arkansas and beyond. He became known among local hunters for his almost supernatural ability to find game and his uncanny instinct for weather and water conditions. What they didn't know was that his success came from an heightened awareness of being watched, a sensitivity to the hidden eyes that tracked his movements through landscapes that harbored more secrets than most people could imagine. Years passed, and Noah's encounter gradually took on the quality of a half-remembered dream, vivid in emotion, but soft around the edges where memory had worn away precise details. He never spoke of it to anyone, never wrote about it again, never sought out others who might have had similar experiences. Some truths were too large and too dangerous to share, too likely to be diminished by the telling. But on foggy mornings when the familiar became strange and the ordinary world seemed to shift around him, Noah would remember the smell of wet fur and the sound of rumbling laughter. He would touch the small scar on his palm where he'd cut himself opening the safety deposit box to retrieve the hair, and he would smile at the knowledge that wonders still existed in a world that had grown too small for most people to see them. The creatures were still out there, still watching, still keeping their ancient bargains with the few humans wise enough to respect the boundaries between worlds. Noah had been privileged to glimpse that hidden reality, and he carried the memory of it like a secret flame that warmed him against the cold certainties of modern life. Sometimes, on nights when the wind was right and the darkness complete, he thought he could hear them calling to each other across the vast wilderness of the Arkansas Delta. The sounds might have been owls or coyotes, or simply the imagination of a man who'd seen too much to ever feel completely at home in the rational world again. But Noah knew better. He knew the difference between the ordinary sounds of the night and the voices of something that had learned to speak in the spaces between human understanding. He knew the creatures were still there, still real, still waiting in the fog for the next hunter who ventured too far into their domain. And he knew that when that encounter finally came, as it inevitably would, the cycle would begin again. Another human would cross the invisible boundaries that separated the known from the unknowable, and another story would be born that no one would believe, that no one could prove, that no one would dare to tell. The thought comforted Noah more than it should have, this knowledge that the world remained vast and mysterious despite humanity's best efforts to measure and catalogue every corner of it. Somewhere in the Arkansas swamp, ancient eyes still watched from the shadows, ancient voices still whispered in languages older than civilization, ancient bargains still held between species that had learned to coexist by maintaining their distance. Noah Carter had touched that world for one terrifying, wonderful morning, and he would carry the memory of it until the day he died. It was enough, more than enough. It was everything.